Hello, everyone. Welcome. If you haven't already helped yourself, there is some juice and coffee and cookies and things like that in the back, and you're more than welcome to help yourself to that. My name is Paul Franks, and I'm chair of the philosophy department. If you didn't know that already, welcome to the Tyndale Philosophy Symposium on Faith and Doubt. To begin, I've invited our Senior Vice President, Academic, and Dean of the University College, Barry Smith, to come and say a few introductory remarks. So, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome you. This is exciting to have this gathering, and I want to begin by expressing my welcome to those that are guests with us. Welcome to Trent and Klaus, and also Paul for your fine work in organizing something of this. And on a Thursday afternoon at 5 o'clock to gather together. Students, thank you for your efforts, and I know you won't be disappointed. I know a little bit about those that are coming, those that will be speaking, and I'm excited about what will be shared and the opportunity for dialogue and exchange, and to be part of a first time on our campus here this year is exciting as well. So there's so many ways in which the inauguration of our time together continues to move forward. So on behalf of Tyndale University College, welcome, glad you're here. Students, glad you're here, and all that's a part of it, look forward to a great evening together. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Before introducing our first speaker, I wanted to also say a few words of thanks and just kind of make a short programming note so we're all on the same page about the schedule. To begin, I'd like to thank the Society of Christian Philosophers for their generosity. It was a grant that we won from them that allowed this event to happen, so we're very grateful for that. I'd also like to thank the Office of the Academic Dean, both for some additional supplemental funding, but also for the logistical support provided by those in his office, in particular Joanna Ratz and Neil Lamont. They helped make all of this happen. I'd also like to thank our Dean of Students, George Sweetman, for allowing us to take over the Student Common Room to have it here, so thanks for that. We did have to change locations once due to demand, and it's starting to get really packed, so maybe we should have had even bigger room to go to, but so thanks for coming in. I appreciate that. There are some copies of the schedule floating around. I don't know if you have one or not, but they are somewhere in the room. But if you don't have one, I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of our format. So we'll have 4 different speakers, all speaking on the topic of faith and doubt. But instead of having a dedicated Q&A period after every session, we thought we would hold off and have a single question and answer period at the very end. Given the overlap in themes and ideas that's likely to occur in the presentations, we thought it might be the case that some of your questions would be of interest to more than just one of the speakers. So we thought we'd have a general question and answer period at the very end. Just prior to that, there will also be an opportunity for each of our speakers to interact on a panel session where they can respond to each other, some of the ideas that came up in each other's papers. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker. He is a fellow Torontonian, Dr. Klaus Cray, who is professor of philosophy just down the road at Ryerson University. Professor Cray earned his PhD from the University of Toronto and has authored scores of important journal articles in very prestigious academic journals like Religious Studies, Faith and Philosophy, the American Philosophical Quarterly, and many others. At least one of his articles was actually co-authored by a graduate of the Tyndale Philosophy Program, Chris Dragos, who is here as well. Their co-authored paper is becoming widely cited in the literature on axiology and theism. Professor Cray is also the editor of a recently released book published by Routledge entitled God and the Multiverse, Scientific, Philosophical, and Theological Perspectives. Professor Cray is a true friend of the philosophy department, and it really is an honor to finally have an opportunity to host him on our campus. Speaker number 3 finally made it. Thank you. Yeah. So it really is an honor, Professor Cray, to have a chance to have you here on campus with us. So please join me in welcoming him as he presents on his topic, Doubt and Disagreement.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here and to be on a panel with such distinguished philosophers who even show up. Myron, that's great to have you here. And it's a real honor and a privilege to be at Tyndale in particular. This is a very, very special philosophy department. I think probably most of you in the room know that. But it really bears underscoring, right? I mean, what this department is able to achieve with only two faculty members, two full-time faculty members, is really quite extraordinary. As many of you know, this department manages to place graduates in all sorts of very prestigious graduate programs. I've had the good fortune myself of supervising a number of terrific graduates from this department. So real kudos to the faculty members, to Davis and Franks, who do such great work here. And since I know there are some administrators in the room here, I will just say this. Please support the initiatives of this department. It's an outstanding place. Okay, so what button am I pushing here? There we are. So the theme here, I guess, is faith and doubt. I'm afraid I don't have anything really to say about faith, so I thought I'd talk about doubt here. And specifically, I'm going to talk about one kind of reason for a certain kind of doubt, namely having to do with disagreement. And then I'm going to talk about one strategy for responding to that potential source of doubt. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say a little bit, for those of you who don't know maybe, about a debate that's happening in epistemology, which is a subfield of philosophy having to do with belief and knowledge and justification. And this topic is the epistemology of disagreement. So I'm going to give a little introduction to that. Then I'll say something about one view in this debate, a view due to Catherine Elgin that I call, this is my term, community-oriented anti-revisionism. Then I'm going to try to defend her view against a bunch of objections. We'll see how many objections I have time to get to, and then I'll wrap up with a few closing thoughts. I don't know if we have enough handouts, but anyway, maybe folks can share a little bit. Okay, so imagine, just to sort of prime the pump here a little bit, imagine that we're out to dinner. Okay, and then it comes time for the bill to arrive, and we're trying to figure out how much each of us owes on this one common bill. And so I do my calculations, and you do your calculations, and we come to a different number. Here's a question. As soon as you realize that the other person has come to a different calculation, should that make you less confident that you were correct in your original calculation? There's a certain inclination to say, yeah, as soon as you realize that someone else came to a different number, you should maybe reconsider or check your work or reduce your confidence, something like that. There's a thought in the ballpark there. Or suppose we're watching a horse race, and I think that horse A won the race, and then I learn that you think that horse B won the race. And I have no special reason to think that you're addled in terms of your perceptual apparatus or whatever. Upon coming to learn that you think that a different horse won the race, some people say, well, yeah, you should be less confident in your original conviction that indeed it was horse A who ran the race. Thirdly, for the students here, suppose you're about to submit a paper for a course, or for the faculty members here, suppose you're about to submit your new paper to the Journal of Complicated Studies, and as you're just about to hand in the hard copy or push send on the email or whatever, your colleague, your fellow student, your colleague, faculty member, bursts into your office or into your room and says, wait, I have this objection. What you say, you're arguing for some claim P. I don't think that's right. So there's a line of thought that says, as soon as you realize that someone who's, more or less as smart as you disagrees with you, that you should be a little bit less confident in the view that you held beforehand. Okay. So those are stories meant to kind of prime your intuitions here a little bit. There's a big literature now in epistemology on the debate on disagreement between what are called acknowledged epistemic peers. So what's an epistemic peer? Well, here's one prominent definition. Two people are epistemic peers with respect to some question when they're roughly evidential and cognitive equals, when they're roughly equally familiar with all the evidence and roughly and equally intelligent and fair-minded in assessing the evidence. So those two people are epistemic peers. And what is it to be an acknowledged epistemic peer? Well, look at the words in yellow there. The thought is this. You discover that some other person has formed an opposite opinion, just like in the three stories I told, right? You have good reason to think that the other person is, at least roughly an epistemic peer. So it's an epistemic peer who's acknowledged to be one. So I'm using it, there's a lot of different terminology here. I'll use this terminology. Revisionists say that when you're in a dispute with an epistemic peer, once you realize that someone disagrees with you, who's a peer, you should reduce your confidence level. Maybe you should doubt what you thought before, and that's the connection to doubt, right? In fact, the thought is that you are rationally required. The dictates of reason, whatever they are, require you to reduce your confidence level in the view that you held prior to learning of the epistemic peer. That's what the revisionists say, and the three stories that I told are meant to kind of prime your intuitions for the revisionist view. Of course, it's terribly controversial, like everything else in philosophy, so there are people, I call them anti-revisionists, who think that that's not true, who think that you're not required by reason to reduce your confidence level once you come into contact with an epistemic peer who disagrees with you. Okay, so there's a big debate about that. A couple of authors recently have tried to broaden the scope of this debate. Because you might think, well, that's an interesting puzzle, but how often are we really in a situation where someone is a perfect epistemic peer? Can we really ever perfectly share our evidence and those sorts of worries? That thought is out there in the literature, and partly in response to it, a few authors have tried to broaden the terms of this debate a little bit. So Jennifer Lackey and Nathan King in some recent papers want to do just this. Lackey's point, in a nutshell, is this. If we're bothered by these thoughts that the revisionists want us to have, we shouldn't simply be bothered by encounters with people whom we in fact deem to be epistemic peers. We should think about those people whom we should think of as epistemic peers, right? Maybe Myron here is my epistemic peer, even though I don't want to think that he is. So if it's someone that I should think is my epistemic peer, then perhaps this should worry me, right? So Lackey wants to broaden the topic in that way. And King's paper is very interesting. The nub of it really is that he thinks we should reframe the debate to be not so much on what we share or have in common, but rather, as he puts it, about what hasn't been fully disclosed. Okay, I won't get into all the details of these papers. I have some minor criticisms of each of them, but I'm sympathetic to their spirit, and so I've sort of stuck these proposals together into a claim here, which I'm going to call LK, Lackey and King, with a little star, because I've made some changes, right? This is the way philosophers like to do things. They put stars in front of, or behind letters. Okay, so here's the thought. And again, this is supposed to be a reason, if you have a certain sort of inclination, for doubt. A reason for thinking that you're rationally required to doubt things. So here's a circumstance. Suppose someone, S, believes some claim, right? And P here can stand for any proposition you like, any claim you like. And then you're aware of somebody else who either believes not P, right, who believes that P is false, or who maybe is neutral, agnostic, suspends judgment about P. Okay, so imagine you're in that situation. And suppose that this person, S, doesn't have any reason to think that her overall epistemic position makes her more likely to be right. Right? In a situation like that, this conditional claim says, S should reduce her confidence. She should maybe even start to doubt her belief that P. Okay. So anti-revisionists want to say that. Revisionists want to say that. They want to say that you should reduce your confidence when you're in the situation described by LK. Anti-revisionists, as I'm now using the term, we've broadened the debate, anti-revisionists want to resist that claim. Okay. So there's a big literature about the narrow debate, peer disagreement, and a lot of the points there can be applied, I think, equally to the slightly broader debate. So just to give you a bit of a sense of the lay of the land here are some arguments on both sides. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, there's no time. I'm just going to zero in a minute on one particular strategy for the anti-revisionist. Okay. So revisionists, right, in a nutshell, revisionists are people who say that when you're in this kind of situation, you should reduce your confidence in your beliefs. Maybe it means you should doubt your beliefs. Okay. So how do they defend this view? Well, these kind of toy cases, right, the restaurant case and the horse race case and the paper submission case, they're really meant to prime your intuitions, as I said. They seem really intuitive. It really does seem, doesn't it, that when we're in situations like that, we check our addition, we wipe our glasses in the horse race, we review our paper, whatever it is that we do. We're suddenly less confident simply because we've come to learn that somebody disagrees with us. It seems like that describes what actually happens. Revisionists want to say, and indeed that's what ought to happen, right? So they go a little bit farther. So there's a lot of, in this literature, a lot of appeal to these kind of toy cases. So it's an open and contested question whether those cases transfer to other kinds of cases, but we can get into that later. There's a worry, I think, among revisionists that the other position, right, the anti-revisionist is someone who says, no, it's okay to stick to your guns, even when people disagree with you and you don't have any reason to think that you're right. it can seem a little bit like question begging. It can seem a little bit like saying, you know, I'm right because I'm right and I don't have to worry about you. Or maybe it seems like you're not taking the other person seriously, right? There's a worry that says that, look, if you're allowed to say that it's okay to stick to your guns in this scenario, that could lead you to become unduly confident, right? It seems like if you're allowed to give extra weight to your own view, then I should just go around and find people who disagree with me. And suddenly by doing that, I'm allowed to become more confident in my view. And that seems, at least to some people, a little bit crazy. So those are a few arguments in favor of the revisionist view, the view that says that when you're in this situation, you should be less confident. Well, anti-revisionists, of course, have a whole bunch of arguments themselves, right? So one thought is, I don't know if anyone's actually published this, but one thought might be, this revisionism, this bothers me, right? It seems like it's going to lead, yes, to doubt and maybe to some kind of crazy skepticism, right? Maybe if every time I'm in a situation like this, I should reduce my confidence so much that it's going to lead to a really unpalatable form of skepticism. I think that's actually a sentiment in this debate, that this bothers people. Whether or not that's a good argument, of course, is another matter, right? There is, secondly, allegedly a self-referential problem for revisionism, right? So revisionism says, look, when you're in this circumstance where you're not sure that you're right, you should revise your confidence. But wait a minute, don't revisionists also assert a claim? Don't they say that revisionism is true? But that is a contested claim, is it not? So the revisionist can't consistently be confident in her own claim about revisionism itself. The revisionist at most could sort of say, well, I have a little bit of confidence in my view. Of course, actual revisionists want to have a lot of confidence in their view. Thirdly, you might say, look, well, I simply can't reduce my confidence level in these situations. And so if I can't do it, it simply can't be that reason requires me to. There's this principle that ought implies can, and the contrapositive is, well, if I can't, then it's not the case that I ought to, right? That's a bit of notation there. But the thought is, look, if it's something I can't do, reason can't make me do it. Reason can't oblige me to do it. There's another thought here, this is my second last one, there's another thought here that says, look, there's a cost here, right? If every time that I'm in this scenario where I have beliefs and someone disagrees with me and I don't have a decisive reason or whatever to know that I'm right, that if I'm always required to revise, then that's going to demand too much. It's going to somehow or other compromise my own integrity, right? You might imagine how that could go in a religious context, for example, but it needn't be a religious context. Okay, so those are a few anti-revisionist arguments. I'm not going to talk further about any of those. I want to talk about a provocative defense of anti-revisionism due to Catherine Elgin and say a little bit about it. And I should thank my former student and Tyndale alumnus Kirk Lougheed here, who worked on this while he was a master's student with me a few years ago. He really pushed me to think harder and harder about this issue, so I'm very grateful for that. So what's her view? Well, just a little distinction first. So she thinks that we should focus in this debate not on belief, because she holds the view, as other epistemologists do, that beliefs aren't actually voluntary, right? We have the beliefs we have, but it's not really up to our will. We can't just will ourselves to believe things. This is a view in epistemology. If you think belief is voluntary, then the rest of her argument can still go through. Just think of belief when she uses her term acceptance. So she's not the first to introduce it, but she employs this distinction between belief and acceptance. Acceptances are voluntary in her terminology. Okay. So what is it to accept something? Well, here's her definition. To accept some claim, let's call it P, is to adopt a policy of being willing to treat P as a premise in inferences, or to treat P as a basis for action when our interests are cognitive. Okay. That's all the background you need at this point for Elgin's argument. So what's her argument? In a nutshell, she thinks this. She thinks that it can actually, on occasion, benefit a community of inquirers, if people stick to their guns, if people don't lower their confidence every time they're in one of these kinds of disagreements. Okay, here's just a quick paragraph. It's on your handout. Here's what she says. Notice there's a bunch of qualifications. The view only kicks in when these qualifications are met. When the reasons favoring each side of a dispute are sparse or exceedingly delicate, or when the evidence is equivocal, or each side can solve problems that the other side can't, it may be better for the community You see where I got community-oriented in my name for it. It may be better for the community that both positions continue to be accepted. Each group, you've got the people over here defending one view and the people over here defending the other view. Each group can draw on a different range of commitments for premises in their reasoning and as a basis for action. By arguing it out, right, by developing their positions, she says, they put them to the test. Tolerance of disagreement is especially valuable, only when the disagreement is among parties who are, smart enough, have sufficient expertise, and so forth. But when those conditions are met, a community of inquiry may best be served if epistemic peers resolutely reason, in other words, when they stick to their guns, and act on opinions about which there is this disagreement. Perhaps in the fullness of time, the disagreement will be resolved. That remains to be seen. So the nub of it, right, is that there can be benefits not for the individual, but for the community if people stick to their guns, even when they can't prove that they're right. That's a little bit informal, but that's basically the gist of her view. And I used to think this view was totally crazy. And Kirk wore me down a little bit. And I now think that this view really has quite a bit going for it. I'm not sure that it's going to succeed. So what I want to do is explore it a little bit and to try to defend it against a few objections. Do I have, 12 minutes left?
Yep.
Something like that? Okay, let's see what I can get done. So Elgin doesn't say a lot about this, but there's actually some empirical evidence that I think supports her position, right? I mean, it turns out that psychologists have studied this. Maybe some of you know more about this than I do. But it turns out that psychologists have done all sorts of tests on how well groups that have various kinds of diversity perform in prediction exercises and in problem-solving exercises. And guess what? It turns out that diverse groups, under certain circumstances, do better in solving problems or making predictions than homogeneous groups, or as opposed to individuals. The results are really quite striking. They've got percentages on this. I'm not going to get into the details, right? So certain kinds of groups that have a certain kind of diversity are better at getting to the truth. Okay, how does that bear on anti-revisionism? You can probably see where this is going, right? The thought is this: a community of inquiry can benefit if there are these various positions being defended with confidence, right? If people aren't always lowering their confidence whenever there is disagreement, right? The thought is that in a way, and philosophers of science, by the way, have had something to say about this, the thought is that we can really divide up the cognitive labor, right? So one lab or one group is arguing in a certain way, and another lab or another group is arguing in a certain other way. And the fact that they're each sticking to their guns and not sort of lowering their confidence once they realize there's disagreement can actually benefit the community as a whole. That's the thought, right? One specific point it's too interesting not to mention here. There's a view, it's a controversial view, but there's a view of reason, a view of the development of reason, rather, that holds that doing this can actually confer advantages. So the view is called the argumentative theory of reasoning. It says that reasoning arose, in evolutionary terms, not to get us to the truth, but that the function of reasoning was to win arguments. And the thought is this: confirmation bias, we all teach our students, is a terrible thing, but this is actually a kind of an attempt to rehabilitate confirmation bias. The thought is that when you believe a certain view, you of course go out and look for other arguments that support your own view. That's a well-known, documented phenomenon. And the thought is that doing that, if a bunch of people in the group are doing that, each confirming, trying to confirm their own view, but still talking to the other, that that's going to benefit the group as a whole, that that's going to help the group as a whole get to the truth. Okay. So these are, of course, just descriptive claims, and controversial ones at that. At least the second point is, we have to remember this anti-revisionism is a normative claim. It's telling us about what we ought to do, or that it's not the case that we ought to do something or whatever. So we need to be careful there, right? But I still think those results are suggestive. Okay. A few objections. Obviously, I can't do this completely comprehensively, but let's make a start here. One author says that a view like this licenses or permits or justifies irrational confidence levels. And as I put it like that, that sounds a little bit unfair as a criticism, right? The very issue under dispute here is whether it's reasonable to be confident in your own position when you find yourself in this kind of a disagreement, right? So it won't do at the outset to stipulate that doing so is irrational. That's precisely the question under investigation. So at least as put here, I don't think that that's a reasonable criticism to make. You should investigate Elgin's view and see whether or not it permits this, but you shouldn't just assert it at the outset. Okay, well, if you were reading carefully, that big block quote that I put up from Elgin, she has a phrase that's, I think, could be a little bit tighter. She says that both parties' positions or opinions are equally worth accepting. And remember, accepting is the slightly technical notion for her. And I'm not sure she should say that, because then it sounds like she's begging the question. Then it sounds like she's saying, look, it's okay for both people to stick to their guns, which is not a premise. That's supposed to be the conclusion of her argument, right? So anyway, I think this is actually just a minor point. This is my view. I think this is a minor point. She could have simply said, I don't have a laser on this thing, but she could have simply said that these views are, prima facie worth accepting, or they pass some minimal epistemic threshold or something like that. She doesn't have to go the whole way to say that these opinions are worth accepting. She could just say, oh, they look like they're not crazy views, right? She wants to rule out crazy views. No anti-revisionist wants their view to license crazy views, right? Okay. But maybe this is what bothers people. Maybe it's bothering some of you. You might say, look, I'm a person living in the world. I have these disagreements all the time. And what I really want to know is when. When do I stick to my guns in the face of disagreement? And when do I modulate my view? When do I doubt? Right? That's a deep question, I think, that we all face. But is that a criticism of Elgin's view? I don't think so. Right? I don't think Elgin is in the business of giving us a roadmap of exactly when it is that we should stick to our guns in life and when it is that we should reduce our confidence level. That's not her project. It's an important project, but it's not hers. She's merely trying to argue that it's false that we should always revise when we're faced with these kinds of disagreements. That's all she's trying to do. So if she can offer a sensible model for how it could be that we're sometimes not obliged to revise, she's done her job. She doesn't, I think, owe us more than that. Yeah, but isn't there something funny about this view? Doesn't it somehow seem to license nasty dogmatism? Or doesn't it somehow seem to promote mean-spirited acrimony, or insert whatever nasty words you like, right? Well, let's set aside the acrimony part right away, right? Whether a view promotes acrimony or not is not especially connected to whether the view is true or false, right? So let's just leave that aside. Does it permit dogmatism? Well, I suppose it depends what you mean by dogmatism. If dogmatism means irrationally holding to your view in the face of disagreement, then that sounds like a question-begging response, right? You need to establish that it permits dogmatism, not just sort of assert it, right? That's the very issue, I suppose, under dispute. So I'm not terribly impressed with this objection either. Yeah, but, right? I mean, this view, I think, bothers people, and maybe it's this. Maybe you might think to yourself, well, look, I do care about whether my group gets to the truth, scientific group, philosophical group, religious group. I care very much about whether my group gets to the truth. But really, I care much more about whether my beliefs are true. I'm a person. I'm not sort of a spokesperson for the group or something like that. I care very much about my own individual beliefs. Maybe I think my salvation depends on it. Or maybe I think my right conduct in life depends on it, or who knows what I think. But someone might say, look, it's the individual that matters here, not the group. And isn't Elgin inappropriately telling us to worry about the group when we should really care about the status of our own beliefs? Well, as I put it here, I don't think this objection is decisive either. I don't think that she's requiring us to do anything. I don't think she's telling us to suborn our interest to the group. She's merely saying, remember the logic of it, she's merely saying that it's rationally permissible to stick to your guns. That's all she's saying. That's different from requiring you to sacrifice your interest for the group. So I don't think that objection succeeds. Okay, a few minutes left still? So one more objection in the last few minutes that I've got. You might say this, okay, all right, this sort of in the abstract, this seems like it might be a way for it to be okay to stick to your guns when there's disagreement. But you've got to be in a pretty special position for this view to really kick in. And maybe it's something like this. Maybe if you're entitled to stick to your guns, maybe you can only be so entitled if you reasonably believe, or accept, to use her terminology, that doing so is, all things considered, likely to bring about those benefits, right? If you think it's totally unlikely that your sticking to your guns on a particular occasion is going to actually benefit your group, well then surely it's not rational to stick to your guns, right? So it must be something stronger. It must be that it's likely, all things considered, that these benefits are going to accrue. Otherwise you don't get to stick to your guns, right? But then, this is not the objection yet, this is the setup. Then the objection is, well, look, how could you ever believe that? How could I ever say to myself, how could any of you ever say to yourself, look, it's okay for me to stick to my guns because I see that in the fullness of time this will benefit my community and help it get to the truth. You got to be a pretty special agent to know something like that, or even to reasonably believe something like that. How could Elgin respond? I would respond, if I were her, by trying to make this condition a bit more modest. I think maybe Elgin could say, look, that requirement in green and a bit of yellow that I just put up is too strict. That's not what's required. Something lesser is required. So what I've obviously done here is replace the italicized yellow, all things considered, with something more modest. Maybe it's this, right? S has got to reasonably believe or accept that sticking to her guns, given the relevant evidence she can reasonably be expected to get her hands on, is likely to lead to good enough benefits for the community. That's obviously a weaker constraint. So if she can argue that weaker constraint is enough, then I think she can avoid this particular objection. Okay, let me wrap it up. Look, there's a lot of work still that needs to be done here, and I'm sure some of the questions or issues that I'm going to quickly set out here are occurring to you as I go through this, right? I just threw this phrase at, relevant evidence that's relevant to whether the community is going to get to the truth. Well, what is relevant evidence anyway? We might want to have a discussion about that. And what sort of relevant evidence is reasonable to expect this particular person who's sticking to her guns to get her hands on, right? What is that anyway, right? So I think some more work is needed there. Does she have to not only possess the evidence, but recognize it to be evidence? That's a stricter requirement, right? And anyway, what is it for an epistemic benefit to be adequate, right? If the thought is that I get to stick to my guns because 100 years from now my community will get a very small step closer to the truth, you might say, that's not enough, right? So what is that threshold for adequacy? I think more work needs to be done there. So I have some, I think the view might be promising, but I think it needs more development. The view as a whole does as well, right? She put a lot of qualifications in the paragraph that I quoted, right? She didn't quite phrase it this way, but the thought is that this view, this anti-revisionism, this permission to stick to your guns, only kicks in for views that are not totally crazy. They've got to be up to a certain level of epistemic snuff. Well, what is that level anyway, right? And anyway, what counts as an epistemic benefit? Is it getting all the way to the truth, or a little bit closer, or a few more justified beliefs? I think some more development could happen on that front as well. And by the way, a question that I'm sure has occurred to some of you that I haven't talked about yet, what is a community? Are we an epistemic community? Yeah, in some sense we are. We in this room tonight, we're interested in faith and doubt. But of course, there are lots of different communities. What gets to count as a community and what doesn't? Are there sharp boundaries here? And isn't it plausible to think that we are members of multiple different communities, right? So we might be part of a religious community, we might be part of a university community, we might be part of a family community. And what happens if sticking to your guns benefits one community that you're part of, but harms another community that you're part of, right? There might be some special worries here that Elgin doesn't address, right? And there might be a worry here about disagreements that could be a challenge for her view as well. Because as soon as you're entering into this rarefied debate in epistemology, you're suddenly part of a community of people who's thinking about disagreement. So maybe does the view license its own steadfastness, or is there a self-referential problem here? I think some more work needs to happen there. But maybe that's just all philosophical quibbling, right? I want to end with a couple of positive points. I think that the issue of peer disagreement is very interesting. I welcome the efforts of King and Lackey to broaden it. I think it's a real live issue that all of us struggle with, whether we're philosophers or not. I think it's an important issue to think about, and I like the way they're broadening the terms of the debate. And I think that Elgin is in the minority here by focusing on the communal nature of our investigation. I think that's really important. It's an important part of epistemology that we shouldn't forget, and maybe has been neglected in this particular corner of epistemology. So, to sum up, right, one reason for doubt, the theme here is faith and doubt, one reason for doubt that I think is a serious reason for doubt has to do with these worries about disagreement. I think there are serious worries or serious challenges here. I've laid out some of the intuitions in favor of revisionism, that you should be more doubtful or more prone to revise your view. I've laid out some of the other side, right, some anti-revisionist positions, and I do think that Elgin's view is promising, even if more work remains to be done. Thank you very much.
I would like to note for our other speakers that Professor Cray ended at exactly 5:40, right on time. So thank you for that. No, thank you also for that interesting paper. I look forward to the question session. I think that will be interesting as well. Our next presentation, I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker while our IT department gets his PowerPoint presentation ready. Our next presentation is from another good friend of the Tyndale Philosophy Department, this time from the other side of Canada, Vancouver, Dr. Myron A. Pinner, who is a professor of philosophy at Trinity Western, and he's also the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Trinity as well. Professor Pinner earned his PhD from Purdue University and has since authored numerous articles in a whole host of different areas, most notably in epistemology and also the philosophy of religion. Like Professor Cray, he is also a co-author with a different Tyndale philosophy student, Kirk Lougheed. So it's really exciting to see our Tyndale graduates go out and make genuine contributions to the philosophical community. It makes us quite proud. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pinner as he comes to speak to us on doubt, its proper function and response. Thanks.
Well, before I get into my paper, let me just join class and others in thanking Paul and Rich for inviting me here today. And I just need to say to all of you here, this won't be any news really to those of you who know Rich and Paul, but just how fine they are as colleagues. We really are co-laborers, both as philosophers, as Christian philosophers, as Christians in philosophy of religion, as Christians in philosophy of religion in Canada, as Christians in philosophy of religion in Canada who work at private Christian institutions of higher education. And so this is quite just a great thing that we've been able to forge over these years as colleagues across the provinces. I've been fortunate to be able to come to Tyndale and connect with undergraduates here and also faculty colleagues. So we've had a number of Tyndale undergraduates come to Trinity Western and take our Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Humanities, and the quality of education that they have received here has just been outstanding, and they've gone on to great success, as has already been mentioned. All right, so I'm going to focus on, in my talk, doubt as it relates to belief in God. And the thing that I really want to address in my paper today is this idea that doubt in certain Christian contexts is seen as a bad thing, right? So when I talk about the role of doubt and its proper function, I want to kind of disabuse us a little bit and to give doubt a bit of a chance in Christian context. And I want to be able to lay out a framework that will enable us, I hope, to have the concepts and language to explain how that can be the case. If you have a sense that doubt sometimes is okay as Christians, as religious believers, then this talk will be for you. If you think that doubt is anathema, then you can have at me in the Q&A. All right. So I'm just going to I'm going to pretend that this works. And it is on. Tech support is on its way. I fought traffic on the 401, and this is what's going to sink my talk. I'm sure you'll take care of that. Do you want to advance them for you? I can sit over there. There we go. All right. So this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Belief, certainty, and doubt. I want to talk a little bit about the conceptual landscape here. This might be old news for some of you who've taken some philosophy, but I think it's worth doing a bit of stage setting. I want to talk a little bit about why do some Christians in particular fear doubt, and I think it's in response to a number of different myths that are out there, bad myths that I think influence our thinking here. I want to talk about doubt and belief, two biblical cases. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I am a Christian who sometimes reads his Bible. Like someone can read Kierkegaard and become a philosopher, I can read the Bible and become a biblical scholar, right? So we're going to look at two cases from Mark 9 and from John 20, just in brief. And then I want to end with what I'm calling some lessons both for doubters and believers. All right, so belief, certainty, and doubt. What is it to have a belief? I'm going to use the common sense philosophical convention and talk about belief as just thinking that some claim, some proposition, something is true. Beliefs can be true, right? The beliefs that we have, they can be true. The Canucks have never won the Stanley Cup. This is something that unfortunately is true. But beliefs can be false, right? The Seahawks have never won the Super Bowl. This is something that is, someone might believe this, right? Some Super Bowl conspiracy theorist might think, oh no, they didn't win that Super Bowl. It was all a sham. But they would be believing something that was false. They should have won 2, or 3, depending on who you talk to, but nonetheless. Regardless, to believe something is to think that some claim is true. And what all beliefs have in common is that whether they're true or whether they're false, the person having the belief, what? Well, the person having the belief thinks that the claim is true, right? So beliefs can be true, they can be false, but what they all have in common as an act on the part of a cognizer, of a believer, the believer thinks that the claim in question is true. Okay. Well, I want to now introduce this idea of holding a belief with a varying degree of strength, right? All beliefs, whether they're true or whether they're false, can be held with a certain degree of conviction, a certain degree of strength, which is to say that some beliefs that you hold quite strongly would take quite a lot for you to overturn them. Other beliefs that you think are true might not require that much by way of counter evidence for you to give it up. Right, so I know when you look at me, you think I'm a finely tuned athlete who had great hops and must have been a mad scorer when it comes to basketball. And if you thought those things, you'd be correct, actually, in relative terms. I did play a lot of basketball in high school, but it was in southern Manitoba. We had a graduating class of 42, so it was not really, they were scraping the bottom of the barrel to get people on the team. But I have this memory, right, of this one time. Right, the one magical night when we were playing Morden Collegiate, and they had tall people and we were all short, and they had people who could shoot, and we didn't really have very many people who could shoot. And for some reason, I know not what, it was tied at halftime, and it was a close game all the way throughout the end, and we actually won when the point guard made the game-winning basket with like 2.4 seconds left, and we won by a single point. And I have a memory after that game of walking into the locker room and the coach saying, "Penner, you scored 36 points." And this was like the high point of my athletic career. It's all been downhill from there, right? So if you were to ask me, do you believe that you scored 36 points that night? I would say yes. This is something I believe that is true, right? But there's also something that I believe is true when it comes to basketball Myron. I know I have a strong degree of belief that I have never slam dunked a basketball unaided by trampoline or a springboard or a bench of some sort. I do not have the sufficient vertical. I mean, I have a recurring dream in which I do slam dunk a basketball. It's a glorious thing, and I always wake up disappointed. But it's this awesome dream where I'm in the key and I'm kind of using my elbows appropriately, and I go up and just with 2 hands and thunderous force, I slam down the basketball, and this is a dream that I have. But it's just a dream because I know that when I'm awake and I'm remembering my basketball career, I'm very confident that I never slammed a basketball. Well, why do I bring this up? So when it comes to these two things that I think are true, me scoring 36 points and me not slamming a basketball, I am very confident that I never slammed a basketball. I would bet lots and lots of money. But even though I think that I did score 36 points, it wouldn't, I mean, you could maybe convince me otherwise. It wouldn't take as much effort for me to give that up. Maybe it was, I knew I scored a lot, right? But maybe the scorekeeper made an error, or maybe I'm misremembering, right? Maybe it was 30-something. Maybe I actually scored more. Who knows? So all of this to illustrate that beliefs, whether they're true, whether they're false, they can be held with differing degrees of confidence. All right, well, let's now talk then about psychological certainty. Psychological certainty is just believing something with maximum strength, having the unshakable conviction that some particular claim is true, right? So psychological certainty is just this idea that the degree to which you believe something is the highest degree possible. You have an unshakable conviction with respect to how much you think it's true. When it comes to basketball Myron and no slam dunking, I'm approaching psychological certainty. I mean, I have a very, 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 very strong, virtually unshakable conviction that I've never slam dunked without the aid of springboards, trampolines, that kind of thing. All right. Well, conspiracy theorists, I've mentioned conspiracy theorists before, often have something approaching psychological certainty when it comes to things that they think are true. And the beautiful thing about any conspiracy theorists here? Chemtrails, 9/11 was a hoax, anybody? So the great thing about conspiracy theorists is that everything counts as evidence for your belief, right? Things that seem to suggest that your belief is false are somehow spun into a narrative where it now counts as evidence for what you think is true. And that way, they're able to maintain this high degree of psychological certainty because they see evidence for their conclusion everywhere. Fundamentalists often have something approaching psychological certainty for similar, though different reasons. And I'm talking about whether you're a religious fundamentalist or an anti-religious fundamentalist, someone who's not really taking countervailing evidence seriously, but they're using it as a way of shoring up something that they've already decided has to be true. All right. So we've talked about belief. We've talked about psychological certainty. What then is doubt? Well, I'm just going to talk about doubt then as the degree to which we think that something is false, right? So what doubt does then is doubt is that which prevents us from being unshakably certain that something is true, right? So think back to basketball Myron and my 36-point belief. Well, I harbor a little bit of doubt about it. Not much, but a little bit of doubt, and it's that little bit of doubt that prevents me from being unshakably certain that belief is true. Often when, another common belief that I have where I'll harbor a little bit of doubt is when I leave my house and I ask myself, did I lock the door? Right? Or did I close the garage door? Did I remember to close the garage door? So there have been many times where I'll actually turn around, go back home, and check, oh yeah, okay, I did close the garage door, and then I can go to work. Right? So doubt is that which prevents us from being unshakably certain that something is true. And understood that way, some measure of doubt is consistent with believing something. Right? So I can believe that P is true. However, believing that P is true is also consistent with having some measure of doubt with respect to P. It's just that measure of doubt that prevents us from being unshakably certain about it, even when we think that it's true. Now, of course, if your doubt increases, your belief will shrink, and there will be a tipping point such that your doubt will overwhelm your belief, and it's no longer the case that you think that it's true, right? So that's just to say that when it comes to strength of conviction with which we believe that something is true, there's kind of a spectrum there. Well, here's two little pie charts. I'm not really good with charts, but I think these are pie charts. Is that right? Are these pie charts? So on the left, we've got, both charts illustrate cases of belief. But on the left-hand side here, we've got someone who, the darker section reflects belief, and the lighter section reflects doubt. And it's someone who's pretty sure. Whatever claim it is that we're trying to map here, the chart on the left shows someone who is pretty confident. But on the right, whence then is doubt on the right? Well, it's just this really teeny tiny sliver. It's virtually non-existent. On the right, we're supposed to illustrate someone who is absolutely certain in the sense of psychological certainty that we're talking about. So we have two different cases here of belief. We can see then that belief is consistent with a measure of doubt, and when you have virtually no doubt, you're psychologically certain, you have this unshakable conviction that something is true. Well, here's a question. Is it ever okay to doubt? Is it ever okay to be unshakably certain that some claim is true? And if we were in one of my classes now, maybe we'd vote, because that's how we settle things in philosophy. We vote. So we'd say yes or no or not sure. Well, is it ever okay to doubt? Well, I think the answer, of course, is obviously yes. Right? Of course, it's perfectly fine in certain contexts to be less than unshakably certain that something is true, right? Regardless of subject matter, the degree to which we think that something is true has to be appropriately related to a whole host of factors, including our environment, including our evidence, including our experiences. And there are going to be times when those factors make the most appropriate response, perhaps it's belief, but something that is less than psychologically certain, right? Unshakable certainty rarely fits the evidence that we have. Right? We are rarely in a position where the evidential support that we have for some claims being true supports an unshakable conviction that it is true. Right? Think back to my 36-point belief. Right? I mean, this is something that I do have evidence. I've got a memory seeming. I could go, I'm sure there are archival documents somewhere in the recesses of Zone 4, Southern Manitoba Athletic Conference that I could go dig out, right? So there is evidence that I could marshal, but even then, it wouldn't license an unshakable certainty that I actually scored 36 points. So that kind of unshakable certainty rarely fits the evidence that we have. And in fact, here's an interesting thing. Unshakable certainty can often, it's not a logical entailment, but there's a strong connection between having an unshakable conviction that something is true, particularly in matters related to religion, that justifies really bad behavior. It can provide some sense of internal justification for harming others, right? When you feel so unshakably certain that some belief about, let's say, another people group is true, you can justify doing things that you would never do in other contexts because you've got this unshakable conviction. And if it doesn't fit the evidence you have, it's really a way in which your cognitive life is having ethical ramifications. Also, having a psychological certainty that some claim is true can really prevent you from being in a position to receive new evidence, right? So this unshakable conviction, we in classes talk about this epistemic community. I mean, if you've got diverse points of view and there's that one section of the community that they're holding their claims with psychological certainty, well, those would be fun people to hang out with, right? Because how are you going to have any kind of good conversation? Well, so conversely, some doubt, right, some measure, some openness to countervailing evidence, some openness to the experience of others, will generally be of better fit with the evidence that we have, and it can also be a better lead to a demeanor of humility in interaction and positive relationships, right? So it's okay for us to doubt, even for things that we believe are true, to have some measure to which we that prevents us from being less than psychologically certain. All right, but why? What about God beliefs? What about your beliefs about the Bible? What about your beliefs about the good life when it comes to following God? What about beliefs with respect to salvation and the nature of all of these different things? Why is it that some Christians fear doubt? Well, it's because in many cases, when it comes to the things of the gospel, there's a sense that, well, no, actually, certainty is and even this psychological certainty is a good thing. Is that really the case? I want to ask some questions here. I think some Christians fear doubt because they've been captivated by a few things that are not true. I call this bad myth number 1. It's in red, so you know it's like, you got to fear it, right? So vibrant faith means all certainty all the time, right? This is an idea, I think, that is prominent in certain Christian circles, and it's this idea that if you want to have an authentic faith, you have to hold everything with respect to the gospel with the highest degree of psychological certainty possible. But you might ask yourself, well, why should I think that that's true? Why should I think that a vibrant, authentic, God-honoring Christian faith and community requires me to believe everything with the highest degree of psychological certainty that one can muster? Sometimes certainty can be really bad, right? I mean, can you think of a biblical example? I'm thinking now of the Gospels and Jesus' interactions with different groups. Who were the people that he seemed to have the most, tense interactions with was the people who had the highest degree of psychological certainty that their religious beliefs were true, right? And they were unteachable. And I think that there's a real model there when Jesus says you need to come to the Father as children, that there's a sense in which the cognition there of certainty is being set aside. All right. Another reason that this is a bad myth is that if you have this view that vibrant faith means all certainty all the time, one of the implications is that it can drive doubt underground, right? You might be, if you have doubts, if you harbor doubts about some particular point of doctrine, some larger philosophical or theological point that's relevant to your faith, if you're in a context in which, no, authentic Christian faith means all certainty all the time, it's going to be very difficult for you to come forward. I don't know, speaking now about some cases at Trinity Western, right, where, I've encountered students who have come from this context where it's unclear to them that even university campuses can be safe places for them to express their doubts. And so one of the things I try and create in my own classroom space is this notion that it is a safe space for people to express the doubts that they have. All right, bad myth number 2. I think sometimes Christians can think that doubt is a bad thing because they've got this idea that we choose what we believe. Right, so belief is, and this relates to Klaus's point about whether belief is voluntary or not. If a person thinks that belief is voluntary, that what you believe is a product of what you choose, then unbelief is the product of sinful choice, right? So any degree of doubt is a function of you just not choosing well, right? So believe, and believe strongly. You can do it. You can choose it. And I think that that's just bad epistemology and bad epistemic psychology. I would subscribe to the view of belief being involuntary. What we believe isn't really a function of what we choose. Belief just kind of happens to us. I could offer you $1 million to believe that you're in Vancouver right now, where the cherry blossoms are blooming. And the flowers are out, right? And you would, you're carnal. You'd probably lie and want the $1 million, but you wouldn't believe it. You couldn't. You couldn't just choose it. It's not something you could just force yourself to choose, even when it might be in your best interest. What you can choose is you can choose perhaps where to go for evidence in some degrees. You can choose what kind of practices to engage in, where to hang out, what kind of epistemic peers you want to hang out with. And those might lead to belief in some cases, but you can't choose particularly where to believe. All right, bad myth number 3. Sometimes people think that doubt is a bad thing because it puts people into contact with beliefs that are other than their own, and they think that that's bad because the idea is that everyone needs to be Christian in exactly the same way. Oh, it turns out that it's my way. And everyone needs to believe all the same things with respect to the Christian life. Oh, those happen to be my beliefs, right? Well, that's not right. I think we need to recognize that there are diverse journeys within the Christian family, and that we have the possibility of being mistaken on some things that we think are true when it comes to the Christian life, right? And so if that's the case, we need to have a certain amount of humility, even when it comes to encountering the beliefs of those who think differently, even when it comes to matters about the gospel. So I don't think it's right to say that everyone needs to be Christian in exactly the same way. And so, yeah, just this idea of fostering a community of humility versus one that embraces psychological certainty. Now, I don't want to say that I don't want to just wallow in doubt. I don't want to say that doubt is the most life-giving thing that there is. That's not the message I want to give. There are times when doubting can be hurtful and sad, because when you doubt something that is true, right? When there's a description of the world that is true and you doubt that it's true, particularly when the claim that's being doubted is life-giving, doubting that is sad. It's a sad state of affairs. There are many people who reject medical care, They reject vaccinations, they put their family, they put other people at risk. There are people who would reject the opportunity for life-giving transfusions for various reasons, people who would reject all sorts of things when it comes to medical care that could be very helpful and life-giving to them, and the rejection of that is, in my view, a sad state of affairs. People who reject the claim that God is reconciling all things to himself through Jesus Christ. Rejecting that life-giving claim is sad. So I don't want to say that doubt is something to be embraced in and of itself just because it's an intrinsic good. That's not certainly what I'm claiming. What I do think, though, is that the role of doubt is to maintain a degree of belief that is less than psychological certainty. Does doubt have a proper function? Well, it's going to depend on what the proper function is when it comes to the particular cognitive subsystem we're talking about. If we're talking about the proper role that doubt has as cognitive faculties spit out beliefs about the world that we think are true, well then it could be that you have some cognitive faculties, the proper function of which is not truth, as Klaus was saying earlier, but some other output. And if that's the case, then doubt would really have no proper function there at all. So the thing I would just want to point out here is that different cognitive faculties that we have, different cognitive systems, might have different purposes or different outputs that will have different degrees of doubt as corresponding to their own proper functioning. So when it comes to the larger question, though, of belief in God, the things that we think that we should think are true, I think a lot of the direction that Klaus was pointing into with respect to Elgin's paper about this idea of an epistemic community, I mean, there are analogies there for Christian community. People putting into conversation with each other not only epistemic peers, but also sisters and brothers in a community of faith. How much time do I have, Paul? Okay, good. Two biblical examples, just quickly. In Mark 9, we have this context of a failed exorcism. Jesus and a crowd of disciples. There's some kind of argument going on between Jesus' disciples and teachers of the law. A father comes and tells Jesus that he had brought his son to be healed of this state, and Jesus' disciples couldn't do it, right? And so there's this exchange between the Father and Jesus. Could Jesus, take care of what his disciples couldn't? And this is that famous quotation, or that famous part in Mark's Gospel, where the Father says, is asked if he believes that it can happen, and the Father says, "I do believe, help my unbelief," right? So right there in that one claim, you have this mixture between belief, thinking that something is true, but less than psychologically certain, right? Less than maximal certainty with respect to the belief in question. And what does Jesus do, right? Jesus says, well, go back and come to me when you're certain, and then I will heal the boy. Is that what he says? No, that's not what he says. Jesus' response, as recorded in the gospel, is to perform a miracle and to heal the son, even though the father, in this case, was less than psychologically certain, had doubts, believed but had doubts. This next passage comes from John 20. This is the context now is post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And of course, who was the disciple? Who was the doubter? Thomas, right. So Thomas has this, I'm paraphrasing here, I won't believe that Jesus is resurrected. I won't believe it until I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side. And how is it that he is responded to by Jesus? Jesus never appears to Thomas because Thomas lacked faith. Is that what happened? That's not what happened either, right? Jesus' response was to appear to Thomas and to visibly give him the signs that we're looking for, at least as it's recorded in John's gospel. So I look at those and I think that Jesus' response to the doubters that he encounters have this kind of feature to them. He seems to offer what he can to give them what they need as honest God-seekers in order to believe, right? They are not ridiculed, they're not belittled, their doubt is taken seriously, it's not mocked, and he responds to them with what he has, more resources than you and I, but the portrayal is that he offers and responds with what he can in order to help these honest God seekers believe. So quickly in sum then, for doubters, if you're a doubter, you can't choose to believe, so don't feel guilty about your inability to choose to believe, but you can choose to seek God. You can choose to seek God honestly. You can choose to seek life-giving sources for belief, whatever they may be. Certainly take philosophy courses, you Tyndale people, because the truth matters, and where else will you find it in the university? You can engage in life-giving practices. These are things you can choose to do. For believers, right, and we're talking now about believers in God, perhaps you have a strong and unshakable conviction about all things related to God. You might be uncomfortable with doubters. They might make you nervous. You might not understand them. They might make you think that, all sorts of uncomfortable things. But you need to give doubters, both inside and outside the church, you need to give them a hearing. Why? Because Jesus gave doubters a hearing. You need to give doubters love, and you need to give doubters respect as image bearers of God. You also need, as you're able to, offer what you can, what you have, which might be conducive to belief, right? But you can't make them choose to believe because no one can choose what to believe. Belief just kind of happens. That's all I got.
Thank you for that, Professor Penner. We have our next speaker actually will be joining us all the way from Chicago via Skype, and so we're going to have just a few minutes to set that up, and then whenever it's time, so maybe 2 to 3 minutes, and then our Associate Dean Natasha Duquette will introduce our next speaker. Okay, thanks. Are we already signed into the Skype account? Great. Rich is just walking over now. So that was great. There's a lot of parallel to this. Brian. Hey, man. Good to see you. Glad you made it. Yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah. I'm glad to be here.
Too many of you concentrated in this room. I couldn't stay downtown.
You're just pulled over like a moth to the flame.
Gravity of Christian philosophy and
are we logged in yet already?
my life is yeah, well, my wife and I don't exactly
So she's here. Hey, man.
Hey, what's up, Trent?
I forgot you were here.
Well, I wasn't here for the start downtown.
Yeah, well, of course.
Yeah, but this is market. It is. I'm on the market. It sucks. Had a couple interviews, but they're not going to pan out.
Kristen, we're just having a short break while we got this working, and so in a few minutes Natasha will be here to introduce you. Can you hear okay?
I'm having a super hard time hearing you.
Oh, okay. We'll take care of the sound in just a minute.
Okay. Do I have time for a bathroom break?
Okay, thank you. Natasha, your friend is on the screen. All right.
That one was open range, and other shirts told me that they're
Should be.
I haven't heard anything positive from your post. I've heard from
I'll tell you about it. Where's everybody sitting? Friends. Sit wherever you want. I'm sitting here close back. Trent and Myron are up in the front here. That's my son. That's your boy, man. Nice. Yeah, it's great result. Yeah, good. Multi-stage, multi-year career. We're almost as good as Ryerson. That's amazing. Everything's really good. Okay, that's good. Super smooth. We're on schedule.
None of my
Mike's working great.
Yeah, the SCP are really anxious.
I applied to a job in Chicago. Nobody got it.
Is that a new thing that you're doing that with these guys?
I don't know. Kevin Timpey stressed that it would be really good to have that up on the web.
They want to deliver.
Did you talk to Trent about entry? He was all talking to the
Yeah, I think he's near the back, yeah.
some sort of
Hey, Tia.
cool.
Good. Hey, Jeremy. Yeah, I haven't opened it. I've opened it, but I haven't gone to the link to the
No PowerPoints or handout. Where am I sitting? I got a spot for you right there where that water bottle is. That was the
and a bunch of.
All right.
Thanks for the kind words.
I was tempted to say, and administrators need to hire about 3 more people.
It was pushing. Are we good over here? Oh, okay. Let me know when you're ready, and I'll get everybody back together.
Tasha! Tasha, I see you. Hi. Tasha, hi. I can't hear you at all. Yes, that I heard. Oh gosh. Okay.
Let me just see if
Hi.
So are we good? Okay. I'll call everybody back. Okay, so if you could go ahead and take a seat again, we'll get started. We've invited our Associate Dean, Natasha Duquette, to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, so everybody come back and sit down. This is really high for me. Okay, there's a handout for the next speaker, and Dr. Franks will be distributing the handouts. Okay, so Kristen Irwin is an assistant professor of philosophy at Loyola University in Chicago. She came to Loyola in 2014 after teaching at Biola University in Southern California. She earned her PhD in philosophy from University of California, San Diego in 2010. Prior to that, she received a BA in philosophy and history from Hillsdale College. Dr. Irwin's teaching and research interests include several philosophical topics in the 17th and 18th centuries, including conceptions of reason and belief, the nature of faith, skepticism, philosophical theology, particularly the problem of evil, and theories of toleration. She's published pieces in Philosophy Compass, Studia Leibniziana, The Modern Schoolman, Criterion, and new essays on Leibniz's Theodicy. She's currently working on an anthology chapter on Locke's philosophical theology, and reference article on Pierre Bayle, a paper on Locke and Bayle's arguments for religious toleration, and a paper on the coherence of Bayle's skepticism with moral knowledge. Kristen and I were colleagues at Biola University, and so I can also say with sincere respect that she is a strong triathlete, a loyal friend, and a brave woman breaking new ground in the philosophy of religion.
Wow. That's a very nice introduction, Natasha. Thank you. Sorry, Dean Duquette. I hope everyone has the handout that Dr. Franks has kindly agreed to distribute for me. I realized my paper is actually a bit longer than my time allotted, so I'm going to dispense with some of the formalities of the biographical details about Pierre Bayle. He was a fascinating character, and I could talk about him till the cows come home, but I won't do that now. I will save those really interesting details for whatever Q&A we have time for during our panel session at the end of the conference. So let me just jump right in then to my main topic, which is Pierre Bayle on faith and belief. So Pierre Bayle is often read as one of the first modern philosophers to insist upon a conflict between the conclusions of reason, often referred to as the conclusions of the natural light, and faith, often referred to as conclusions from supernatural light. The clarifications to the second edition of his Historical and Critical Dictionary is the text in which he highlights the tension most explicitly. In these clarifications, he paints a stark picture of the incompatibility of what he calls the articles of the Christian faith and the natural light. That's his terminology in the clarifications. Unlike his contemporaries, such as Locke or Leibniz, Bayle puts the two sources of truth squarely in opposition to one another. So you have a representative instance of Bayle's position on your quotation 1 on the handout. This is a passage from the clarification on the Manichaeans. The mysteries of the gospel, being of a supernatural kind, cannot and should not be at all subject to the laws of the natural light. They were not made to stand the test of philosophical disputations. Their grandeur, their sublimity, does not permit them to submit to it. It would be contrary to the nature of things. La nature des choses, that's a technical term in French. It would be contrary to the nature of things for them to emerge victorious from such a combat. Their essential characteristic is to be an object of faith and not an object of knowledge. They would no longer be mysteries if reason could resolve all the difficulties concerning them. And thus, instead of finding it strange that someone admits that philosophy can attack them but not repel the attack, one ought to be scandalized if someone said the opposite. And he has that nice footnote for people who actually do try to reconcile the mysteries with philosophy, thankfully. Their motives can be good, he says, if it has God's blessings. Funny guy. So in this passage, Bayle's explanation of the relationship between philosophy and theology initially sounds not very different from that of his contemporaries. The mysteries of the gospel are not subject to the laws of the natural light, and they are too grand and sublime for philosophical disputation. This has echoes of Leibniz's above reason, against reason distinction. And Bayle even concedes that some of his contemporaries who attempt to reconcile theology and philosophy are doing work that is, quote, beneficial. But even in this passage, I think the radical nature of Bayle's position emerges. He notes that it would be contrary to the nature of things for the mysteries to withstand the test of philosophical disputations, to emerge victorious from such a combat. This suggests that, absent any further clarification, the mysteries would be demolished by reason's interrogation. Further, Bayle seems to emphasize that it's actually scandalous to expect philosophy to be able to repel its own criticisms of the mysteries of the gospel. This implies, however, that the mysteries are not beyond reason, since reason itself is able to mount, quote, attacks of the mysteries. It would be foolish, Bayle argues, to think that the mysteries could survive these attacks. I think what is perhaps most interesting about this passage, though, is that even in light of reason's attacks, Bayle doesn't seem to think that the rational defenselessness of these mysteries is a particularly negative consequence. This is a surprising conclusion, but Bayle seems to be untroubled by the status of the mysteries, I argue, because of the limits of rational belief itself. So that takes me to the second section of the paper, the limits of rational belief. So what are the limits of rational belief? That's the $60,000 question, maybe $1 million, adjusting for inflation. For Bayle, the faculty of reason is primarily a critical faculty, useful for exposing errors and inconsistencies. Far from the rationalist conception of reason as a robust faculty that functions as a source of truths about the world and oneself, Bayle's conception of reason is skeptical. And its positive function is limited to evaluating how, quote, plausible, the Greek word here is pithenon, how plausible beliefs are. Reason is useful for determining validity, for ferreting out contradictions, for performing reductios and other logical operations, and for raising objections. It does not, however, provide either belief content or certainty regarding substantive philosophical knowledge. The most significant function that it serves for Bayle is to verify that the conclusion of a valid argument is true if its premises are true, what I would call hypothetical knowledge, and to give us brute certainty about basic moral maxims through what he calls right reason. That's a whole nother paper. If you guys have questions about that, we can talk about that later. Yet for Bayle, reason has a more insidious character as well. It often attempts to continue raising objections in such a way that it undoes its own salutary work. And two passages from the dictionary, not from the clarifications, but from elsewhere in his dictionary, show that Bayle conceives of reason as a deeply corrosive force. And I apologize for those of you guys who ate dinner, because some of this is pretty graphic. I hope it doesn't mess up your stomach. Philosophy can be compared to some powders, medicinal powders, he means, that are so corrosive that after having consumed the oozing flesh of a wound, they eat away the living flesh and decay the bones, piercing them to the marrow. Philosophy first refutes errors, but if it's not stopped there, it attacks truths. And when it is left to its fantasies, it goes so far that it no longer knows where it is and no longer finds anywhere to sit. This must be imputed to the weakness of the human mind, or to the improper usage that it makes of its supposed strengths. And from another article, this is my favorite quote, actually. Our reason is proper only for confusing everything and for making us doubt everything. No sooner has it constructed a work than it gives you the means to ruin it. It is a veritable Penelope who during the night undoes the cloth that she had made during the day. The best usage, then, that can be made of the study of philosophy is to understand that reason is a path of mental turmoil and that we must search for another guide, which is the revealed light. While the last passage is admittedly more provocative than persuasive, I think that taken together, these passages, from the very work to which the clarifications were appended, highlight the particular conception of reason that is the focus of the clarifications. Reason, and in these passages, Bayle's using the word philosophy, reason is indeed helpful as a purifying element in dialectic. It can eat away diseased argumentation. It can expose chicaneries and faulty reasoning. But this purifying function quickly becomes destructive if it's unleashed on truths. This observation is important, I think, because it means that truths, all by themselves, are just as susceptible to being demolished by reason as falsehoods, if reason is not used appropriately. According to the second passage, it's not just truths independent of reason that are imperiled by reason's operation when it ceases to guide well. Even truths that reason itself has painstakingly constructed and verified by its own resources are subject to its acidic dissolution. Bayle makes an exception in reason's operation for the possibility of using right reason to discover basic moral maxims. And as I said before, I don't have time to defend this exception here. But I think it's important to note that even though Bayle attributes a more positive function to reason in the moral domain, it still doesn't provide an answer to skeptical worries about the impotency of reason to deliver certain knowledge outside of the moral domain. And Bayle is not unaware of this predicament, as evidenced by the end of that second passage. That's where he suggests that a new guide is necessary, the revealed light. Shortly, I'm going to argue that I think that should be understood as faith. Okay, so reason and the epistemic authority of faith. We are now in a position to offer a new reading of one of Bayle's most famous declarations. And this is the one that lots and lots and lots of people who read him either as a surreptitious atheist or as an irrationalist a la Kierkegaard like to quote. This is sort of the famous quote that he's known for. One must necessarily choose between philosophy and the gospel, or what we might call reason and faith. The text surrounding the declaration, though, describes both the limits of rational belief and the epistemic authority of faith. I want to examine the context of this declaration more closely, and that is going to be quotation 4 on your handout. And I actually have a bit more than what I put on the handout. It's quite a long quote, so I'll go ahead and read it. A true believer, a Christian, who knows the genius of his religion, does not expect either to see it conform to the aphorisms of the Lyceum or to be able to refute the difficulties of reason by the force of reason alone. He knows very well that natural things are not proportional to supernatural ones, and that if one were to ask a philosopher to put on the same level and in a perfect harmony the mysteries of the gospel and the axioms of the Aristotelians, one would be demanding of him that which the nature of things does not admit. One must necessarily choose between philosophy and the gospel. If you want to believe nothing but that which is evident and that conforms to the common notions, then take philosophy and leave Christianity. If you want to believe the incomprehensible mysteries of religion, take Christianity and leave philosophy. For to possess évidence, the French word, I'll talk about that in a second, and incomprehensibility together is something that is impossible. The combination of évidence and incomprehensibility is only slightly more impossible than the combination of the qualities of a square figure and a round figure. One must necessarily choose. Okay, so this sounds bad, right? The most frequent interpretation of this passage is that there is an absolute choice to make between philosophy and the gospel. But I think this interpretation is ambiguous. In considering the passage in its context, I think the true sense emerges. The tension between, quote, philosophy and the gospel is at the level of particular beliefs. I think the most important detail of the context is that the dichotomy between philosophy and the gospel is found at the level of things, which is to say particular things. The rhetoric is sharp in this passage, but the context gives us the tools to refine our understanding more precisely on the level of particular things, which is to say individual beliefs. It is true that one must choose between, quote, philosophy and the gospel. That is to say, each particular claim is either an object of reason or an object of faith, and the site of the choice between philosophy and the gospel is always going to be at the level of individual claims, not at the level of philosophy as a whole or the gospel as a whole. I think this is supported by Bayle's use of specific examples, the specific doctrines of Christianity called the mysteries. And by the way, for Bayle, I argue that these include Trinity, incarnation, and resurrection. This is not a simple instance of synecdoche, because in the particular case of the mysteries, the dichotomy is a real one. Notice, though, that it's the specific claims of the mysteries that demand a choice, not the gospel as a whole. So Bayle's language explicating this declaration is consistent with interpretation. The qualifier in the explication is this: if you want to believe nothing but that which is evident or obvious, take philosophy and leave Christianity. If one is completely opposed to any beliefs that are not evident, then of course one must leave Christianity as a whole behind insofar as belief in Christianity entails belief in the mysteries. In this case, philosophy as a whole is all that is left. If one wants to believe the mysteries, then of course, in the specific case of the mysteries, one must, quote, leave philosophy behind, insofar as philosophy as a whole is committed to belief only in evident beliefs. But this says nothing about choosing either philosophy or the gospel in the case of other types of claims. I don't think there's any necessary implication here that if one, quote, chooses the gospel in the case of the mysteries, one has forsaken philosophy in the case of all other claims. I think this analysis is supported by an explication of the rest of the passage using this particularist reading. Notice that after having laid out the choice between philosophy and Christianity, Bayle gives the reason for this dichotomy. For to produce évidence, which is something like self-evidence, although not exactly, for to possess évidence and incomprehensibility together is something that is impossible. The crucial word here, I argue, together. That permits us to read this phrase with our particularist interpretation of the choice. Indeed, I think it's impossible to, quote, possess évidence and incomprehensibility together in the same claim. But this says nothing about the question of the affirmation of several different claims, some of which have, quote, evident objects, and some of which have, quote, non-evident objects, like the mysteries. Similarly, such an interpretation can be supported by examining the analogy of the square and the round figures. Bale says that the combination of evidence and incomprehensibility is like the combinations of the qualities of a square figure and the qualities of a round figure. What's notable here is that Bale uses a metaphor with particular objects. It's not a question of general domains, but rather a contradiction of fact in the particular qualities that are mutually exclusive. In this way, the qualities of an evident claim cannot be combined with the qualities of a non-evident claim. When Bale says then that one must necessarily choose between philosophy and the gospel, I think that means that one cannot affirm a claim using the criteria and the methods of philosophy and the certitude of faith at the same time. I think the choice depends on the status of the objects of the claim. If the claim concerns, quote, non-evident objects, it cannot be evaluated by philosophy. But this does not imply that philosophical claims and religious claims cannot both simultaneously be held. It merely implies that the same claim cannot be both affirmed on a rational basis because evident and on a mysterious basis because non-evident. If this analysis is correct, then it's possible to read Bale as allowing for some religious beliefs to be held rationally and for some to be held non-rationally. Specifically, the religious beliefs that Bale calls the mysteries, he argues will always be held non-rationally. Those are the cases in which one really must choose the gospel over philosophy. But since this is not a choice at the level of the whole of religious beliefs, there's no once and for all choice between, quote, philosophy and the gospel. The choice is made one belief at a time. Bale also explains the source of faith's epistemic authority in this passage. Bale notes that there is a disproportionality between natural things and supernatural ones. He calls it a difference of, quote, level, a kind of disharmony. And given the examples that Bale uses here, I think we can infer that the, quote, mysteries of the gospel belong to the supernatural order, while the, quote, axioms of the Aristotelians functions as an archetype of natural things, what Bale would call natural things. While it's true that this is a kind of ontological distinction, notice that both of Bale's examples deal with beliefs on different levels. I think that's important because I read that as delineating epistemological levels, not merely ontological ones. So for Bale, to say that there is a disproportionality between these levels of belief implies that it would be contrary to, quote, the nature of things for these two sets of beliefs to be epistemically equal. I think an obvious implication of this passage, then, is that this disproportionality yields a similar epistemic inequality at the level of certainty of these beliefs. Okay, so next section, the domain of faith's authority. Before examining the ground of certainty of the Christian mysteries, however, I think an important question to answer in order to fill in the picture of Bale's conception of faith concerns the domain of these mysteries. The, quote, principles peculiar to the gospel, which is another one of his favorite phrases for the mysteries. Insofar as Bale is willing to use reason to criticize, to criticize theological arguments, he typically limits the domain. He is limiting the domain of the principles peculiar to the gospel. I argue this is the case because if the epistemic authority of these principles is higher than that of reason, then they should not be subject to reason's criticisms. So anything that Bale uses his reason to criticize must automatically fall outside of the domain of these core principles. Interestingly, virtually every other major Christian doctrine outside of the Trinity, incarnation, and resurrection comes under attack by Bale at one point or another in his corpus. Further, Bale argues vociferously and at length against the Socinians, a sect that denied the doctrines of the Trinity and the divine nature of Christ. I think this is evidence that Bale does not consider anti-Trinitarianism or the denial of Christ's divine nature to be compatible with belief in the Christian mysteries. Further, for Bale, not only are these truths absolutely certain, but they are true in spite of reason's claims to the contrary. And the Trinity and the Incarnation are his favorite examples of that. In the case of the Trinity, although the principle of contradiction entails that 1 and 1 and 1 add up to 3 and not 1, the mystery of the Trinity entails that 3 persons nevertheless constitute one God. In the case of the Incarnation, although one principle known by the natural light is that a single entity cannot have more than one essence, recall this is in the context of 17th century rationalism, right? The mystery of the Incarnation entails that the same entity, the second person of the Trinity, has both a human and divine essence simultaneously. Bale specifically addresses these two doctrines at the beginning of his philosophical commentary. I think that's on your handout, quotation 6. God forbid, he says, that I should extend the jurisdiction of the natural light in the principles of metaphysics as far as the Socinians do when they propose that every meaning given to Scripture that does not conform to this light and to these principles is to be rejected, and who, in virtue of this maxim, refuse to believe in the Trinity and the Incarnation. No, this is not what I propose without bounds or limit. Now notice, importantly, that Bale does not reject the natural light completely. In fact, the first chapter of his philosophical commentary is itself a defense of the use of the natural light in the interpretation of Scripture. So this doesn't invalidate the principle of contradiction wholesale. It simply means that in the domain of these Christian mysteries, reason is not applicable. So, where is it applicable? Anywhere other than the mysteries. The mysteries come, Bale says, on virtue of faith from the supernatural light. Bale is arguing aggressively for the epistemic authority of the Christian mysteries as against the principles of reason. But why? What is it, then, that provides such certainty and authority to these mysteries for Bale? The intuitive answer is obvious: faith. But what faith is less obvious. For Bale, faith includes not only religious belief itself, and maybe not even that, as we'll see shortly, but also the, quote, certitude that attends such beliefs. And we can talk more about the difference between certitude and certainty. It's not a major difference, but Bale uses the word certitude in French, so I'm going to stick with that. Bale addresses this issue explicitly in a passage from the Clarification on the Manichaeans, and this is your quotation 7. It's a great one. This passage from St. Paul, quote, "We walk by faith and not by sight," unquote, alone should suffice to convince us that there's nothing to gain from one philosopher to another for the person who undertakes either to prove the mysteries of the Christian religion or to take the defensive position. For here's what the difference between the faith of a Christian and the knowledge of a philosopher consists in. This faith produces a perfect certitude, but its object will never be evident. Knowledge, on the other hand, produces together both complete evidence of the object and full certainty of conviction. If a Christian then undertakes to maintain the mystery of the Trinity against a philosopher, he would oppose a non-evident objection to evident objections. Would this not be to fight blindfolded and with hands tied while having as an antagonist a man who can make use of all his faculties? If it were the case that the Christian could answer all the objections raised by the philosopher without making use of anything but the principles of the natural light, it would not be true, as St. Paul affirms, that we walk by faith and not by sight. Knowledge, and not divine faith, would be the Christian's share. This is a great passage, and it reveals two essential features of Bale's conception of faith. First, walking by faith is contrasted to walking by sight, and Bale takes that on from St. Paul. And a hasty reading of this contrast might lead one to infer that faith is therefore blind in some sense. But I think there's another possible construal of this contrast. Just as sight functions as a crucial guide in allowing us to walk, faith plays a similar role when sight is either unavailable or unreliable as a guide. Second, even though Bale consistently contrasts faith with knowledge in this passage, he nevertheless ascribes certitude to both. The relevant distinction between faith and knowledge for Bayle is not at the level of certainty, but rather at the level of content. Objects of knowledge are évidents, Descartes would say, perceived clearly and distinctly, while objects of faith are not. There are two elements of this conception of faith that make it particularly robust epistemologically. First, faith includes not just mere belief, but belief with a kind of superadded conviction, usually described as certainty, which I will call certitude. Second, faith confers a kind of epistemic immunity on the content of what is believed, insofar as the certainty of the objects of faith is grounded in faith itself. The objects of faith are immune to refutation by reason. The only possible opening for rational investigation of religious beliefs, then, would be if the beliefs in question were not, in fact, grounded in faith, but rather in desires, emotions, passions, or some other non-rational, epistemically relevant attitude. In cases where religious belief is not grounded in faith, the beliefs in question are not, quote, objects of faith, but rather objects of some other attitude that does not confer certainty on the belief. One might desire or hope or wish for heaven to exist in the afterlife, but if one, quote, has faith in the existence of heaven in the afterlife, having faith denotes a certainty that's not present in the attitudes of desiring, hoping, or wishing. One final but absolutely crucial point is that even assuming an epistemically robust conception of faith with the kind of authority that I've been describing in the immunity, the doxastic content of that faith is indeterminate. This is important because it means that despite all of its other epistemic functions, faith can never serve as a source of belief. Ultimately, it is merely formal, not content. This implies, somewhat counterintuitively, that one could be, for example, a, quote, faithful rationalist, if one believed that reason were the only true source of knowledge in the world and had certainty about that belief, but could not rationally justify it. The label of something like a fideistic rationalist would be accurate. Now, this is a hyperbolic case, right? But it's meant to emphasize the purely formal nature of faith. In contrast to the popular use of the term, quote, faith as a particular system of religious claims, this purely formal and epistemological conception of faith provides no substantive belief content on its own. For Bayle, this means that while the, quote, mysteries of the gospel enjoy epistemic privilege as a result of faith, faith itself cannot function as an explanation of their content. The doxa of the mysteries must come from elsewhere. That's another paper. I have argued here that for Bayle, rational belief has limits, and that his conception of faith is purely formal and epistemological. What I've not done, however, is answer the question that follows naturally on this account of faith. If it's true that for Bayle, faith only provides epistemic privilege to these core mysteries without providing the content, then what does provide the content? This is, alas, a question for another time and another paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that paper, Dr. Irwin. That was really, really fantastic. Also, thanks to our IT department for enabling you to present it to us. So thanks for that.
Thank you, IT.
So I think they're going to set you up so that you can stay live with us and not have everybody stare at you the whole time. So
Awesome.
Our final speaker for this evening is our keynote speaker, and it's my honor to introduce him to you now. Tonight's keynote is from Dr. Trent Doherty, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Dr. Doherty earned his PhD actually not too far from here over at the University of Rochester. He is the author of many articles and books. Some of his books that you philosophy majors may have heard of or be interested in are The Problem of Animal Pain, Skeptical Theism, New Essays, and also Evidentialism and Its Discontents. I was looking through his CV, getting ready for tonight, trying to count all of his peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and I kept losing track of where I was at. It's a lot, and so I'll leave it at that. There are a couple of things that some of the Tyndale students might like to know. Some of you are by now perhaps sick of hearing me continually recommend to you the Oxford bibliographies online and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Sometimes it feels like I begin every lecture by saying, visit these sources. Dr. Doherty is actually responsible for 4 different entries on the Oxford bibliographies, one on the problem of evil, also the existence and attributes of God, another on causation, and a final one on evidence. So he's a primary reason why I keep recommending that to you. He's also the author of the Skeptical Theism entry for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So one of Dr. Doherty's current projects is he's one of the principal investigators of a 3-year project on the nature and value of faith. That's being supported by the John Templeton Religion Trust, and it's and some of his work there on the nature and value of faith that leads him to us tonight for this Faith and Doubt Symposium. To have a philosopher of his caliber with us on campus is a real treat and a real privilege, so please help me welcome him as he comes to talk to us about faith in the face of doubt.
Apparently there are 2 philosophers named Trent Doherty. I'm really excited to hear this guy, meet this guy who shares my name. Okay, so again, I want to thank everybody who put this together and helped fund it. To thank Paul and the others who wrote the grant for the Society of Christian Philosophers for granting it, and for the administration for lending their support as well. It's a really big deal when administrations support their philosophy departments and the other humanities. And philosophy departments and other departments in the humanities need to support one another, bind together, and really reaffirm each other's value to the administration so they continue to support things that themselves support the mission of this school in a way that is very obvious and direct, because we do assert truth claims. Our faith does rest on a foundation of truth claims. So it's important that we support that. So it's going to be really hard for me to stand still. I usually wander, and so I have to be right here. So I told Paul that if I start to wander off and start to trail off, he's got to wave me back right here. I've got to stay in view of the camera. So it's going to be really, really hard for me to stand still, because that's really hard for me to do in general. As he said, I did get my PhD on the other side of the pond over in Rochester. When I was there was a fast ferry, a 55-mile-an-hour giant catamaran that would jet you over here on the lake. And sadly, it failed financially through bad management. But I always thought, gosh, I could just get on the boat to go to Toronto and hang out. Now, Rochester is known for this view called evidentialism. And it's represented primarily by 2 epistemologists there, Richard Feldman and Earl Connie. And they are the main representatives and defenders of evidentialism today. And they were the directors of my dissertation. Hey, what's that? Got to make sure my Facebook photos turn out okay. I went there to study with them because I endorsed evidentialism, and I still endorse evidentialism. And here's a sort of informal statement of what evidentialism is. It's associated often with this guy called W.K. Clifford. But it's got older roots than that. So first, let me give you a version of Clifford's summary of evidentialism. It's pretty hardcore. He says, "It is wrong always and everywhere for any reason to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." Yes. I like that claim. I like that claim a lot. Posing. I like that claim a lot. I really do, except that he uses the notion of belief as a binary thing rather than a non-binary thing. But we'll get into that in a little bit. In a more toned down version that Connie and Feldman defend, the idea is you ought to have the attitude towards a proposition that fits your evidence. I like, even though the view is associated with this guy Clifford in the modern era, or in the more contemporary era, it really came first from, and Hume had a statement of it, but even before Hume, Locke was the guy who really said, Hume had a really nice pithy version. It's the office of the wise man to proportion his belief to the evidence. I really like nice pithy. Hume was really good for coming up with short, succinct ways of saying things. Much better writer than Locke. But I like Locke better. And Locke said this view before Hume did. Locke was a defender of this view, evidentialism, before Hume was. And also Locke had this idea of proportionalism built in, that you proportion the strength of your belief to the strength of the evidence. So like in Myron's talk, he talked about degrees of conviction. And he had the pie chart that showed that could go from a little to a lot. Technically, it can go from 0 to 100 and anywhere in between. And the degree of conviction is a psychological fact about us. It's part of our autobiography. But this, the other half of the evidentialist definition, the fit with the evidence, is not psychological, but logical in a way. Okay? There's this, because the evidence actually gives to the proposition a particular degree of logical support. Okay? So there's psychological support, there's psychological argument, psychological convincing, and then there's being logically convincing. Something can be psychologically convincing without being logically convincing. Trump. By the way, on behalf, I had to do this in Iran recently. I gave a series of lectures in Iran, and where the outcome of this election means more than it does even here in Canada. Who I think is now being referred to as the menace in the North. I think Trump wants to build 2 walls. It's like both sides. So something can be psychologically persuasive without being logically persuasive. And something can also be logically persuasive without being psychologically persuasive. The evidence for some broad form of Darwinian evolution is, I think, logically convincing. But it isn't always psychologically convincing. Some people just aren't convinced by it. But these are 2 different notions. There's the psychology and how it goes up and down, the degree of affirmation goes up and down, and then there's the strength of actual logical support goes up and down too. And evidentialism says your attitude towards a proposition, that degree of psychological credence you give it, is justified when it fits, when it matches up with the degree of evidential support. So if you have a lot of conviction, that's justified when you have a lot of evidential support. If you have only a little bit of evidential support, then the justified attitude is a little bit of conviction. Okay? So that's the basic notion of epistemic justification as it is defended today by across the pond there by Richard Feldman and Earl Connie at Rochester. Now, so I have endorsed this view. Oh, I also think that these notions help clarify one problem with some of the issues that Klaus talked about in his talk. So there's this idea in Klaus's talk that there's a societal benefit, a group benefit to be gained from there being a diversity of views. So I have an attitude towards a proposition. Notice that not just belief or disbelief. It's not just like I say P and Myron says not. Well, that's not a good example. Myron doesn't know anything. So I say P and Klaus says not P, and oh gosh, now we have to suspend judgment. We have to be skeptical because one says P, one says not P. If you model it probabilistically by taking into account the fact that psychological conviction and evidential support come in degrees, then it's more like this. I think it's 80% likely. Klaus thinks it's 70% likely. So we do something like split the difference, and each of us really ought to have an attitude that it's about 75% conviction. Now those numbers are just toy numbers, right? Nobody has an attitude. Nobody says my probability is like 0.75, but there's ranges. There's plenty of ways to deal with that. Those are just models. And so, but the kind of evidential support, the kind of justification that evidentialists talk about, where your attitude should fit your evidence, is proportional, and it's about evidential indication of truth. What evidence is a truth indicator. It's something that points to the truth of something. It doesn't matter how it helps our society. That's a different sort of justification. That's practical justification. So here's how the two can come apart. I think I borrowed this example from Earl Connie or adapt it from Earl Connie. Suppose somebody came to you and said, I'll pay you the $1 million Canadian, which is what, like $52 American? I can't remember right now. I got to take advantage of it while I can, man. I spent a year in England and with a horrible exchange rate, and said, I'll pay you this amount if you believe that you're in, where did you say, Vancouver? And the sun is shining? Yeah, right. So, so he said you can't do that because belief isn't voluntary, but you could, like, I couldn't pay you to just choose to believe the lights are off. But I could bring it about that you come to believe that the lights are off. Forgive me for this. Come on back on. There we go. Yes. So I brought it about. So I wanted to have this belief that the lights are off. So I brought it about that I had that belief, not by choosing, but by taking some actions that I had a high probability of having as a causal consequence that I would hold that belief. So suppose you thought, well, okay, for $1 million, geez, I could pay somebody to brainwash me, maybe give me a pill, maybe put me in a machine, and get me to form that belief, okay? And suppose that a lot hinged on you having this money. Suppose a loved one needed a very expensive operation, and they were in America, so it wasn't covered by the National Health. Of course, maybe they didn't even have the procedure in Canada. I don't know. It's like, which do I choose? Oh, it's been great, guys. That's right. 6 months. You just got to wait 6 months for it. That's right. So suppose something really hangs on this. And so you think on balance, it's totally worth it to me that the best choice I could make right now would be to take these steps that get me to believe this thing that I know is false. So it would be justified to do it, but it wouldn't be justified to do it. That is to say, it would be totally pragmatically justified to do it, but it wouldn't be epistemically justified to do it, at least at the time. It's not like it would be. The epistemic dimension and the practical dimensions are different. Now, one of my goals is to believe the truth. I think believing the truth has good practical value, but just because you're doing something that furthers your goal of having more true beliefs doesn't make that thing epistemically justified. So if I could pay you to have a false belief, or if I could give you a pill that said, okay, this pill will make you believe that you haven't taken the pill, so it'll guarantee this false belief, but forever thereafter, whenever you wonder whether P, you will instantly know whether P. Well, that has a really good, epistemic utility, has a really good outcome with respect to your goal of having accurate and comprehensive beliefs. But it guarantees that a certain belief will be contrary to what the evidence is. So the evidential support that evidentialists talk about and the sort of support that I think Elgin has brought in that group discussion are totally separate categories, even if the practical thing is with respect to an epistemic goal. Just totally different things. Think about it this way. Scientists could discover that having a magic 8-ball assign beliefs to people actually turned out to have good effects on the inquiring community, because it's like lateral thinking, right? You go totally outside the box. You just pick something that just doesn't seem to apply at all, and you just go with it and see what happens. I can literally see that working in certain communities. There's lots of things you might do that would have good effects on inquiring communities in the long run. It doesn't mean you're talking about the same sort of epistemic justification. And this degree thing also fits in very nicely with Kristen's explication of Baal. Is she listening? She's still here? Okay, good. it fits in very nicely with her explication of Baal, because there, evidence isn't this notion of the thing that comes in degrees. Evidence is, as it often is in the early modern tradition, that which makes something evident, that which makes something clear. Think of that VID in evidence. It's from video, it's from see. So you see it clear. That which is evident is seen clearly. But the evident is only obtained at the top of a pile of evidence. If a proposition has evidence, the adjective, then it is perfectly evident. Okay, but and obviously, yeah, something can't be evident and incomprehensible. And like she said, the doctrines of Christianity form a spectrum ranging from things like the God's existence that is taken to be, frankly, fairly obvious in Romans 1:20, all the way to the mysteries of the Trinity and incarnation, which are far, far less obvious and maybe in certain ways incomprehensible to human beings. So all of this is on a sliding scale, just like Myron said in his thing. Okay, so that's the view. That's Lockean proportionalist evidentialism, and I endorse it. Well, I'm also a Christian, a fairly traditional Christian. I believe Jesus was literally born of a virgin, literally died on the cross, literally rose from the dead, literally ascended into heaven, all of that stuff, okay? So what's the evidence for that? How do I square that with my conviction for evidentialism? Okay, well, we've got these faith beliefs. What's the evidence for them? Well, there's lots of beliefs we have that we can't directly verify. One of the great things about my job is it allows me to travel a lot. Loving Toronto. I saw one of the towers downtown. I went to this big tower in Iran, been to the Eiffel Tower, something about towers, I don't know. So who's been to the Eiffel Tower? Lots of you, right? How about I got an invitation to go to China, and I'm really excited to go and see the Great Wall. Who's been to the Great Wall of China? Very, very few of you. Okay, so why do you believe that there is a Great Wall of China? What do you think? You saw some pictures, okay. Well, I've seen pictures of, aliens in a like bed in Area 51, and I've seen pictures of all kinds of things. So why do you think those pictures are of some actual thing? Well, usually it's people, they're in this book and it was a textbook. Okay, well, who wrote the textbook? I have no idea. Oh, so you believe it because you saw pictures in some book by somebody or other. Well, no, it's not just that. It was in school. Okay, well, what was the name of your teacher? Well, I can't remember. Oh, so some person whose name you can't remember gave you a book written by somebody you can't remember that had a picture that claimed to be of the Great Wall of China. This is looking pretty bad. I mean, it's really looking to be. So you can see this is the same sort of thing the atheist does for Christian beliefs. But it's nothing but bullying. It's nothing but philosophy gone wrong. It's nothing but doctrinaire skepticism that probably made Baal, thank you. So, well, I've got Bays on the mind. I'm always thinking Bays. So, that made Baal so upset. And I'm reading right now Thomas à Kempis's little treatise on the inward life, not the imitation of Christ, but his little treatise on the inward life. And it's clear he's really upset at very early scholastics who are just disputing all the time and not turning their hearts towards God. And so I really think philosophy can go very wrong because it's interesting to raise these questions. I mean, honestly, I was being kind of a smart aleck there, but it's a legitimate question. It sounds kind of bad. The case for the Great Wall of China sounds kind of bad. So can it really justify belief? Well, of course it can, but it takes a while. As philosophers, we don't want to just accept, of course, we want to sort of build a theory. We want to talk about how does it do that? How does it do that? Well, the fact that we can't come up with, off the top of our heads, a really great theory of testimony doesn't mean that testimony isn't a perfectly legitimate way to form beliefs. And the fact that we can't answer questions off the top of our head about the nature of the testimony for Christian beliefs in particular doesn't make them irresponsible, doesn't make them unjustified, doesn't make them in any way epistemically inappropriate. And for philosophers to pretend otherwise, that just because there are unanswered and difficult questions that we shouldn't accept the source, is just philosophy gone wrong. The vast majority of what we know by testimony. And we're built that way, too. You might think that our being built that way makes a difference to the appropriateness of the belief, and that's one dimension of appropriateness. There's all sorts of reasons why you might explain. There are many rich, varied, and not wholly consistent views about what makes testimony work. But the bulk of philosophers are completely agreed that testimony works. Some people think that even though it works, we'd be better off knowing on our own, and other people say no, it's perfectly fine by itself. Lots of disagreements by philosophers on the nature and status of testimony. Total, almost complete agreement that testimony is a perfectly legitimate way to form beliefs. Okay? So you shouldn't let the disagreement cloud what is agreed upon, that testimony is a perfectly good way to form beliefs. Now, testimony can be called into question. So sometimes you need to defend the source. And there are obviously benefits to knowing more of the story yourself sometimes. But that totally depends on how you're situated, say, socioeconomically as well. If you're a single mom trying to put dinner on the table for your kids and pay rent and working 2 jobs and walking both ways to work and trying to cover childcare, you have no responsibility whatsoever to read apologetics. Those who've hit life's jackpot and have the leisure to study these things, it's our responsibility to do so. So how much you investigate these things depends on all kinds of things. The fact that you're here tonight is good evidence that you're interested in these things. And I'm sure your teachers here can give you bibliographies on the epistemology of testimony. I'm not going to belabor. I'm not necessarily going to give you my view about that in great detail, though I want to talk about how I think that works a little bit. And I also want to talk about disagreement just a little bit too, and disagreement and testimony, because disagreement can arise in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways disagreement can arise is that you get testimony from 2 different sources that are both in some ways seemingly trustworthy, that say opposite things. And so one thing that might trouble you as a philosophy major or as a philosophically oriented non-philosophy major is that the vast majority of philosophers today are atheists. There was a survey on Phil Papers that showed, 80%, something like that. And that was a self-selected group. And Christian philosophers were less likely to be aware of this poll than atheist philosophers were. But still, there's at least a 2-to-1 ratio of atheists to theist philosophers in the Western-speaking world now. So why is that? Why do you have these smart people, good people who read these arguments and they think there is no God, whereas these bozos like me think there is a God and the evidence indicates that? What are you supposed to do with that? How do you that very reasonably creates doubt. How do you have faith in the face of that kind of doubt? So I just want to use this as sort of a concrete example. Well, the first thing to realize is what a tiny slice of reality contemporary English-speaking philosophers are. They're the leading. They're just the thin. Think of history as this brick, this growing brick of space-time that encompasses every part of the universe that is now or ever has been, in every place that there is. And the present moment is just one slice on the face of that block. And the English-speaking world is just one region on that paper-thin sheet on the face of that block. So if you look at the history of Western thought, from all of the cultures west of the Mediterranean, God is there always. God is in Book 10 of Plato's Laws and in the Timaeus. God is in Book Lambda of the Metaphysics. Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, obviously. And people say, oh, yeah, right. Well, of course, they believed in God. They were theologians. Well, yeah, but that's to discount the fact that you have this massive 1,000-year segment of time in which these brilliant people believed the faith while very purposefully examining it with philosophy. Okay, so it's just ridiculous to say, "Oh, well, they were Christians, so of course, they don't really count." Of course, they count, because if Christianity was irrational, then that makes probable that it wouldn't sustain a culture of detailed philosophical examination from so many different angles. So you've got these great medieval philosophers who start out as Platonists like Plato, Platonists like Augustine and Anselm, and then Aristotelians like Aquinas. And then in the early modern tradition, you have these continental rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, a Frenchman, a Dutch Jew, and a German. Very different kind of thinkers than these medieval guys. All completely think that there's a supernatural, with Descartes and Leibniz believing in the Christian God. Spinoza's views were a little more out there, but definitely believed in the supernatural. Then the tide of philosophy shifts from continental rationalism to British empiricism, and you have Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scot. And they have very different views than the continental rationalists, and very different views than the medieval Platonists and Aristotelians. But all of them have God in their picture. Locke has a proof for the existence of God based on eternal being. Hume, if you read the dialogues concerning natural religion correctly, and even according to Hume's own letters, it's clear that he thinks the existence of God is secured by reason. It's just the nature of God, the exact nature of God, that reason can't secure. But then he ends the dialogues by saying, this is something that revelation can fill in. And then, so there's a lot. And Berkeley has God. You don't even have like sense perception without God in Berkeley. Then you get into, then things kind of go nuts with Kant and Hegel. But still, even in the midst of all that weirdness, God is there. God is a postulate of practical reason for Kant. Kant has what he calls an ontophysico proof for the existence of God. Part of it's in a book called On the One Possible Proof for the Existence of God. So he rejects the traditional ontological argument. He rejects the traditional cosmological argument because of antinomies or contradictions or apparent contradictions that he sees in their principles, many of which, by the way, I think can just be just based on misunderstandings, and so those arguments ought to be reinstated. But Kant believed that it was rational to believe in God and there are proofs of the existence of God. Hegel, his views were again a little more way out there, but still Geist, spirit, God is at the beginning and end of all things in Hegel. You get into the modern world, and again you've got people like Einstein, whose views about God are definitely not Christian, but he's definitely not an atheist, he's definitely on the supernaturalist camp. Darwin himself, though he experienced considerable doubts in the face of evil and suffering, still, when he wrote The Origin of Species, in the very last chapter of the 1859 edition of The Origin of Species, he says, God creates first life, and it creates it in an environment that allows it to unfold in a way that is providential, in a very different way than controlling the whole process. But both in his autobiography and in his letters and in that last bit of The Origin of Species, Darwin was a theist. Darwin believed of the supernatural foundations of the universe. There are people who think he lost his faith at the end, and there are people who think he had a deathbed reconversion to Christianity. Whoever's right about what happened there at the very end, Darwin, for the bulk of his life, was a theist or at least a deist. And then when you get into even the contemporary world, and you think, who are the people who know the most about who are at the confluence of science, theology, and philosophy? You get people like John Polkinghorne, who was a quantum physicist at Cambridge University, who became an Anglican priest and who thinks that faith and reason go hand in hand. You get my personal friend, Father Andrew Pinsent, who just stepped down as the director of the Ian Ramsey Center for Faith and Science at Oxford, who has a PhD in particle physics and was a direct researcher at Oxford and then became a Catholic priest. You have people like my colleague Alexander Pruss, who's the most intelligent human I have ever met and one of the most devout Catholic spiritual men I've ever met. You got people like Peter Van Inwagen, who know insane amounts of physics, contemporary physics, and who don't see the contrary. Stephen Barr, and go on and on and on and on. So to focus on this tiny little slice of space-time, contemporary Anglophone philosophers, is to completely exaggerate the influence that these people ought to have. So I think sometimes how bad the doubts ought to be and how bad the disagreement is really depends on how you frame it and who you think counts. And if you endorse what Chesterton called the democracy of the dead, meaning people's views count even though they're not here, then the atheism is such a tiny minority party that one wonders, how they get so much attention. How much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay. 10 to 12? Okay, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the evidence isn't maximal. It isn't conclusive. Testimony should never, on any matter, I say, make you certain. So on Myron's little, I should have had Myron leave his little pie charts up there. I don't think, but that's nothing really against testimony. I don't think sense perception should ever make you literally certain. I'm what's called a radical fallibilist. I think that we are prone enough to error by disposition and composition that literally nothing should we be certain about. Not even our own existence. I can talk about that later. So, whereas I think that doubts can be exaggerated, I do think we have to take into account that even if we sometimes exaggerate doubt, in my view, doubt will always remain to some degree, and usually in a non-trivial way. So, this is going to bother somebody like, say, Kierkegaard, and I like Kierkegaard's idea of the knight of faith. Can we be a knight of? Can the evidentialist fallibilist like me, which I think is a pretty common sense view, frankly. I mean, believe something, make your strength of belief match your strength of evidence. It's crazy that that's controversial. We could always be mistaken. It's crazy that that's controversial, right? So I take this just to be common sense. So how can a common sense epistemologist like me accept this idea of the knight of faith? And there is a sense in which faith is maximal, even though the evidence isn't. How can we have maximal faith in the face of non-maximal evidence while not giving sort of like special play to faith? Because here's what we don't want, in my view. So Bale apparently thinks of faith as something that sort of makes up an epistemic gap that provides the psychological condition of certitude, even though the evidence does not warrant epistemological certainty. So for a lot of people, they have this Balean kind of view that faith is the thing that sort of makes up for the evidential lack. And maybe in some way, Hebrews 11 makes it sound like that. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. It's not a horrible fit. But in the end, I still think this is wrong. I don't think faith is anything that makes up some sort of epistemic gap. Rather, I think nor I think is James right, William James, that says you just sort of like, it's a practical matter. And evidence doesn't really come into it. You have this, what he called the will to believe. You just sort of like choose to believe because it's like a good thing. So I don't think Bale is right, because I don't think what we need is something that gaps, tries to close this epistemic gap. I don't think James is right, William James. I don't think it's just some matter of like making yourself believe. I think both of those things are sort of inauthentic and fake in a certain sort of way. And when I became a Christian, I made a commitment not to fake it. I'm getting like super warm. I made a commitment not to fake it, that I wouldn't go through mental gymnastics just to preserve my faith. Because I was not raised in the church at all. I was raised completely irreligious. And when I converted in high school, I faced immediate ridicule and opposition, and was in the paper for trying to lead a Bible study on campus that they wanted to close down, stuff like that. But I wasn't going to pursue this thing by having to like make up stories or look the other way or pretend or something like that. I wanted to have a childlike faith, but not a childish faith. And so people, sometimes in class, people really wince when I say this, but if I found that the evidence clearly supported atheism, I would just drop my faith like that. It's coming up on Easter, so you can be assured of one thing. In the supermarket aisles, U.S. News and World Report, Time Magazine, everybody will have the real story of Jesus and the bones of Jesus. They'll all have their little naturalistic stories to sell their papers. And it never comes to anything. It's just always hogwash. Sorry, you can take the boy out of the Midwest, but you can't take the Midwest out of the boy. But what if one of those things turned out to be true? What if they found, like they claimed not that long ago, to have found the bones of Jesus in the grave marked Jesus? They claimed it. And I delved into it. I jumped into it immediately. Read everything I could find on the subject. Ended up falling apart. But if it had held together, and if it had stood enough of a test of time, then I would be forced to conclude that the resurrection had not occurred, and then I would be forced to conclude with Paul that we are most to be pitied because Jesus was not raised from the dead. I would give up my faith. I would not because I would choose to, it would just go away if I saw conclusive evidence that Jesus was not raised from the dead. My commitment to truth is in a certain way greater than my commitment to Jesus Christ. Some evangelical circles, that's very shocking to hear. Of course, in the end, it doesn't matter because Jesus Christ is the incarnate Word, the second person of the Holy Trinity, who is truth himself. So there's no chance of that happening. And there's the commitment is sort of a make-believe change in commitment, but it's an important one. So how do I preserve this idea of sort of the completeness of faith, the maximality of the night of faith, the exceptionlessness of faith in the face of my commitment to evidentialism and that my recognition that the evidence falls short of certainty and that we're always fallible in any of our conclusions? Well, rather than following Bale or James, I think Pascal leads the way here. Not because you sort of choose to believe because it has positive benefits. I think that's a complete misunderstanding of Pascal. But rather, in the way that Swinburne describes in his wonderful appendix to his wonderful book, Faith and Reason, that we distinguish between doxastic faith, or faith as a form of belief, that in my view is just testimony. When you say I have faith that some proposition, that just means I accept it on the testimony of God. I accept it on the testimony of the revealer. If I say I have faith that, I'm going to get reimbursed for some travel expenses, it's because he said so. I trust him. It's got to be in U.S. dollars. U.S. dollars, man. I trust him. I take that on faith. I don't say, no, you got to give me the money up front, or you got to show me some letter from account. No, I accept it. It's totally reasonable. No reason to doubt him. Okay? That's what faith is just acceptance of a proposition Because somebody reliable said so. Somebody trustworthy said it. That's what faith, what's called doxastic faith, or sort of faith when in the belief realm about propositions. But then there's the active faith. Okay? Totally different ballgame. Totally different ballgame. I can form a probability function about the proposition that this chair will hold me if I sit on it. I almost said stand. I was going to stand on the chair. I should not stand on the chair. Yeah, I do this in class, and every now and then things go poorly. But I could form an estimate of the evidential probability that the chair would hold me, and then, or I could just ask. You know, I could say, look, has this chair been checked or whatever? The plane. I get on the plane. I just, you know, I can form an evidential probability, but I just accept it. I just get on. But until I get on the plane, I haven't engaged the active faith in the airline. It's one thing to sit at home and say, yeah, the probability of a plane crashing is super low. And I drove through a heck of a storm. Check it out on my Instagram page. I drove through a heck of a storm. I flew through a heck of a storm getting up to Dallas to catch my flight up to Toronto. Lightning going everywhere, pounding rain, huge black structured clouds, tornado watch, planes skidding off that layer of air on that inversion. The lady behind me was pretty scared. I had to keep myself calm by explaining the physics to her of what was happening, why this was perfectly normal, and why it would continue most likely until we really initiated our final descent. It's one thing to know all those facts and figures and have a correct estimate of the evidential probability, to have my doxastic attitude, my degree of confidence perfectly match the probability of its occurrence. That's epistemic justification. It's another thing to just not be an idiot and look at the stuff, just say, yeah, I mean, the FDA says the planes are fine, so just get on the plane already, you know? But it's a whole different thing to actually get on the plane. That's an act of faith. Now, why can faith in action be maximal and uncompromising when the evidence isn't? Pascal tells us. Because the cause is so great. Because the destination is so worth it. Why did I get on the plane? I mean, think about it. I mean, even if there was a point, like 1/3% chance of the plane crashing, it wouldn't make sense to fly just anywhere, right? If I was going to take a flight to the center of Death Valley, California, it's not even worth the 1/3% of a chance of crashing to get there. But it was worth that to get to Toronto because Toronto's awesome. It really is. I love Tibetan food. And I'm like, I hope Toronto has a Tibetan restaurant. There's a Tibetan district. Went down to Queens West and there were 4 Tibetan restaurants in 2 blocks. It's insane. So the destination makes the risk completely worth it. And when the destination is perfect beatitude in the presence of God, it's worth any risk. Whether I'm 99% sure or 1% sure. Now, that doesn't apply to everybody. Some people might look at it and say, to heck with that. This sounds terrible. Okay, doesn't apply to you. You have no reason for the act of faith. But if perfect union with Yahweh, with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if in that glimpse you see something absolutely beautiful, something better than any possible alternative, then there's nothing you could face on earth that would make it worth risking not getting that. Right now I mainly do mountain biking, but before that my main thing was rock climbing. Number 1 cause of death among rock climbers is not falling, it's lightning. So suppose I'm up on top of some spire. And I'm about to rappel down. There's a storm approaching, and I drop my rope. And there's a ledge, say, 100 feet down, maybe 75 feet down. We can adjust it however you want. If staying on top means certain death, then even if I think, I'll never survive that fall if I jump on that landing, it's still the best thing to do. And other than just sheer physical animal fear, it would be like the obvious thing to do. It's like, well, it's my best chance. Let's do it. No, we're not built that way. We're animals. We have that natural self-preserving instinct that makes it really hard to choose the immediate discomfort and risk over what to the animal brain seems a distant theory. But at an intellectual level, there should be no hesitation. This is my best option. This is the best route I have to the good of living. If I'm in a pit and I have no way to get out, and I think I hear somebody up there talking, then it makes sense to yell out. Is anybody there? Can somebody help me? You don't think about like the embarrassment or the patheticness of calling out alone. This doesn't matter. The good of surviving makes it worth it no matter what. Think of the things you would do to save a loved one. Think of the scrimping and saving you do to go see destinations in the world, or to have certain things, or to have this education. Think of what it's worth to you to preserve vibrant intellectual faith in Canada. I mean, America, we have our own problems in America, but it's really sad to see the persecution of Christians in Canada. I follow that very closely, and it means a lot to me. I've been a Canadiophile pretty much my whole life. I played ice hockey from Pee-wee up through college. So I've always been a Canadiophile, except with respect to Myron. Was it the Neon Cactus was that the name of the place? Yeah. There are pictures on the internet. That's right. 2:30 in the morning. Should we pack it in or should we go back out? Right choice, wrong choice. God will judge. But some things are worth doing. Some things are worth pursuing no matter what, come what may. And I think the promise of union with God, of perfect communion with Him, forgiveness, to be known inside and out, to be in that perfect embrace is worth anything. Worth anything, no matter what. Now, I'm an animal. So if Caesar's representatives come to my door and put a sword in my face and say, Christus vel Caesar, maybe I'll give in. I don't know. I hope I would be given the grace to accept martyrdom. I know that I don't have it in me personally to do it, but I would fully recognize that would be the right thing to do. That would be the thing that made sense. But we're all called to lots of little martyrdoms, even if we're not called to that big public martyrdom. And what makes unswerving commitment, limitless commitment to that, come what may, make sense, is that the destination makes it worth it. Because it's the best possible destination. It has more good than any bad alternative has bad. And that's, I think, what Pascal taught us. And so I think if we just I think people like James and Wittgenstein and all these guys called Phidias and lots of other people and everybody who thinks that faith is somehow like making up for an intellectual shortcoming, I think they're confusing two things. They're confusing the assent of faith, which is just to accept testimony, to trust in the trustworthy, and the act of faith, which ranges free from all the evidential stuff. And I really think if we keep those two things, if we understand how they're distinct, we will have more fulfilled lives, both intellectually and have a better shot at progressing down the path towards becoming the knight of faith and having a sort of saintly faith, which is hopefully for all of us, philosophers and non-philosophers, the goal. Thank you.
Okay, that was a great way to end the symposium, but we're not done yet. My name is Rich Davis. I'm a colleague with Professor Franks in the philosophy department. So what I'm going to ask now is that the symposiusts would take their seats at the front table. And if Rainer could connect Kristen, or Jeremy's on it. If you could connect Kristen, that would be tremendous. And what I'm going to do is try to engender some interaction between our symposiusts a little bit. That will go for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, and Professor Franks will moderate that. So maybe I could just open up this way. At one point or another, Professor Doherty mentioned or referred to each of the other presentations, and so I thought we could have the other three symposiusts maybe engage or respond to respond to some of the things that were said about, say, disagreement, or about Pierre Bayle, or about degrees of conviction from Myron's presentation, and then maybe at the end just have Trent give a response to the things that he hears from the other symposiusts. So would you like to begin, Kristen? Do you have any kind of response to the things that Professor Doherty mentioned about Bayle or anything along those lines?
So mine will actually be short because I just got back to my computer about 3 minutes ago.
Okay.
I was making dinner for my family, so sorry.
That is okay.
I said your presentation was awesome. That's pretty much it.
That's good. Okay, well then we'll just move to Professor Cray.
Sure. So I want to thank Trent for engaging my paper a little bit. So just a couple of slightly disjointed responses, and I'm interested to see what you think. So the worry, if I got you right, was that the view that I sketched attributed to Elgin is really, it's not an epistemic view, it's this prudential thing, right? You stick to your guns so that you get this benefit later on. And that worry is out there, and I somewhat feel the force of it. But very quickly, there might be a way to resist that. There might be a couple of ways to resist it. The first is that it's not like getting some money. It's not that kind of prudential benefit. The long-term goal here has to do with getting to the truth of P. So you might say, look, this isn't just a merely prudential thing. It's very much an epistemic thing. The community is trying to get to the truth about P. Another way to respond that I think is distinct might be to say, look, the question here was not the more narrow one that Trent was focused on, but rather the broader one. What does reason require? Does reason require that you, fold your cards in the face of disagreement or not? Elgin's view incorporates a long-term consideration, a kind of epistemic consequentialism, that would suggest that reason doesn't always require folding your cards in the face of disagreement. So I'm not sure that it's merely prudential, and I think if the question is framed a bit more broadly, then that might be a fair or clear way to characterize her view. Again, I'm not completely sold on her view, but I think it's promising. So that's a brief response.
Okay, and Professor Penner, what I did was I set things up by saying at one point or another, Professor Doherty referred to all of your presentations. Mm-hmm. And did you have any kind of response you wanted to make, or an observation, or about his presentation, or something he said about yours?
Or you.
For the sake of the live stream, would you just try to talk into the mic so they can pick you up?
He did say try. Are you trying, Myron?
Well, I guess so you'd really give it up if you found that there was a compelling, at least an initially compelling evidence set that you scrutinized, you turned it over, and that's not something you could consciously do per se. You're just saying you would just find yourself, it would just fall apart, right? Like, do you think that that it would be rational, and that it would be epistemically rational and not only edifying for your faith, to try and just resist that as much as you can?
No, definitely not. I think, like I said, I may not be able to. Maybe I've got more, wish fulfillment or emotional commitment or whatever, weakness of intellectual integrity than I think I have. But I would hope that I would give it up. and I would form the second order view. I would say, well, even if the view even if the belief just sort of stuck, I would hold the view about the view that it shouldn't be there, and I would try to resist it in any way I could. Just as if someone were raised in a racist society and just kept having these darned racist beliefs or inclinations, they may not be able to get rid of it, but they would sort of intellectually stand against it, and they would try to suppress it showing up in their lifestyle anyway. So that's what I hope I would do. And I think I probably would.
Just wondering if your fallibilism could come to the rescue there, because the way in which you're assessing kind of this damning new evidence, you might be able to kind of play that fallibilist card, like a lot of Christians of different stripes do when they assess evidence from science that conflicts with something that they hold to be true. They kind of play that fallibilist card against kind of the evil scientists and say, well, what you could be wrong, couldn't you? Couldn't you be wrong?
I wouldn't become certain that Jesus hadn't raised from the dead. But that's not to say a lot, because I'm not certain of anything, including that I'm not certain of anything. Maybe I'm certain of something and I don't realize it. I don't know. There's no contradiction there. It's just that's the way our intellectual life works. It's not fully up to us, and it's not fully opaque. It's not fully clear to us. It's not fully transparent to us. Now, I did say that it would have to withstand scrutiny for a certain period of time, because what happens, for example, scientists report stuff all the time that you're like, like that's just not going to hold up. When they claim to send a signal back in time, I was like, no, they didn't. And sure enough, they didn't. And it turns out, when I read the story closer, the main source for it was somebody who I went to grad school with. And because Rochester has this Bausch and Lomb funded optics program. And I'm like, dude, seriously? And he's like, well, it's kind of a way to think about it. Like we impeded the forward progress of a stream of light. And that's kind of like sending a signal back in time. Like, whatever. And the same thing, they claim to accelerate something past the speed of light. And I'm like, I bet they didn't. And sure enough, you wait a few weeks and it wasn't. So when they had this, somewhat superficially credible looking claim, because they said, okay, we found this burial site. It's got tombs marked like James, Joseph, Mary. It's in this region. They did like statistical analyses of the frequencies of those names, and so how improbable it would be that there'd be any one gravesite with all of those names. And so it was like, okay, well, this is credible. This is credible. I looked into it. It took maybe a certain number of weeks or months to get to the bottom of it, and then it just didn't really pan out. And then later it turns out there was some really bad stuff going on there. So obviously you don't conclude. What fallibilism dictates, what the result of fallibilism here, its application here, is that you don't just, it's not just like that. So your credence isn't just going, like that. It's like you got to sort of see if this stuff pans out. So, but my claim was if the inquiry sort of settled on that, then I would hope that my credences would track, my psychological conviction would track that, and eventually lock onto it to where my attitude was evidentially justified. Can I make one criticism of you, though? Another thing I forgot to mention. So in your talk, you gave an example of the importance of, or some of the harms of doubt. I forget exactly what it was, but or the harms of certainty, that you can be too adamant about things and uncompromising. But I thought, what about the flip side of that? And thinking, our confidence that racism is wrong, that or any genocide is wrong. So take that proposition. It seems like I ought to have like this unwavering conviction that genocide is wrong, that rape is wrong, that racism is wrong. So I did wonder what you had to say about that.
So I think in the context of the talk, I was saying that psychological certainty rarely fits the evidence that we have. And so, and then I was saying that, I guess perhaps I was speaking a little incautiously. To qualify it, to kind of exclude those kind of cases, I would have said, some of the harms of inappropriate psychological certainty, or to use your language, of of having an inappropriate degree of confidence that doesn't fit the evidence that we have, is that it in a way that has epistemic detriment, it makes us resist further evidence, right? So if we have, and so then we can't get the right kind of alignment between degree of belief and degree of evidence if we have this kind of inappropriate degree of psychological certainty, because it's going to make us resist the evidence. And I guess that was just the kind of point.
That makes sense. Can I gloss that, just a short gloss on that, because it ties in with my talk really well? So the dialectic was this. In his talk, Myron said, well, if you're too sure of things, that can be really bad because it can make you dogmatic. And I said, well, shouldn't we be dogmatic about some of these moral properties, some of these moral stances? And then the answer is, yeah. Well, notice this. Where do you get those beliefs from? What's your evidence that rape is wrong? What's your evidence that racism is wrong? What's your evidence that ethnic cleansing is wrong? What is it? It doesn't come from physics. It doesn't come from biology. It doesn't come from chemistry or biochemistry. It's moral intuition. You just see it. The same justification you have for believing that 1 + 2 = 3. You just see it. And one of the really bad effects of naturalism on ordinary epistemology, the epistemology of ordinary people, is it undercuts their confidence in their moral intuitions because there's no good naturalistic evolutionary explanation for them.
Well, but you can give a good naturalistic evolutionary story about the cognitive subsystems that generate, beliefs about moral matters and all sorts of things, and then you can give a nice kind of cultural tuning story on top of that to explain why, some people actually rape and ethnic cleansing and genocide are live options, and for others it's not going to be.
Hogwash.
Right? Well, fair enough. I'm not saying, but there is a coherent, robust, explanatory story that can be told with respect to those things. You don't have to just jump to only God can explain the.
Well,
or you didn't have to say that.
Jump, but I just hop, a skip, and a jump. I mean, I think so. There's this literature on what are called evolutionary debunking arguments, and they exist for all kinds of things. And so there's a whole literature on, hey, look, given there's this evolutionary story of why we would hold these moral beliefs, and given that they could have just evolved for their practicality, that undercuts or debunks our confidence in those beliefs. And I think that's just bunk. But Myron's right. Philosophers will do anything, man. There is a literature on, and they're not
purely ad hoc.
No, they're not completely specious. But in the end, I conclude they aren't good, and I think that people do, at the popular level, they do jump pretty quickly from, oh, of course you believe that because that's, adaptive for evolution, so that goes. Of course you believe in God. It's a crutch. It makes you feel better and gives you a survival advantage. That's gone. And so my cavalier attitude is partly just a reflection of the cavalier attitude of a lot of debunkers. But I'll talk, I'll cite the literature on this all day long. I think the anti-debunkers carry the day on this literature.
And Trent, do you want to say something about what class, how his response?
Yes. So I think his first point that the epistemic goods, the epistemic ends of true belief are different than money. I think I addressed that because I gave examples where your ends, your practical ends, were epistemic. In the case where, what could be a better epistemic goal than for any proposition, if you wonder whether P, you'll instantly know whether B. That's an epistemic goal. And I saw that. And the other one was epistemic too, though I've forgotten an example. And so, if you want to see an argument about this, there's an argument by Tom Kelly at Princeton that's a critique of Richard Jeffrey on this. So Richard Foley tends to think of epistemic justification as practical justification with respect to the goal of getting to the truth. I think that's still a separate thing because in one and the same case, you can say, okay, if I believe what I know to be false here, it will have a major epistemic payoff, the best epistemic payoff there could ever be. Always knowing whether P instantly when you wonder whether P. Yet, that doesn't make it epistemically justified to believe this false thing that gets me that goal. So I think the presence of an example, a coherent example where the two things pull against each other, show that even practical rationality with respect to an epistemic goal isn't epistemic rationality. Notice this too. There aren't like different rationalities for every goal. I have a lot of health goals. I'm kind of a health nut. Like Myron, I'm a finely tuned athlete. And like Kristen, I aspire to triathlon. It's probably my favorite overall sport. But I have all these health goals, and I have all these beliefs about what's healthy. I believe you should always eat protein when you're going to eat carbs because it slows down the digestive system and keeps you from having blood sugar spikes. Okay, so I got all. It's not like there's, like culinary epistemology and culinary norms. It's just not every goal gives you a distinct kind of normativity. But also this idea that there's this broader thing called what is reason's requirement. I think that goes too far in the other direction. I don't think there is any such thing as reason's requirement. I think there are practical reasons and epistemic reasons and moral reasons, and maybe more than that. But I don't think there are. I think you can go wrong by chopping it up too finely and going with culinary reasons and ophthalmological reasons and things like that. But I also don't think there's just this one thing called reason's requirement. It's like people who say, here's a moral dilemma, what should you do? Sometimes I just think there's no answer. I literally think there's just no answer. You can't satisfy every norm that is in play. And so I think the right thing to do in the situation she gives is say, well, there's this kind of reasons requirement and there's that kind of reasons requirement. Epistemic reasons requirement is you have your degree of confidence match the degree of evidence. Practical reasons requirement is that you do what maximizes expected utility. Now, sometimes they come into conflict. Which should you choose? Well, there's lots of options there. Some people say they're incommensurable and there's just no answer. Other people say practical reason always trumps. Other people say it's up to you. There's lots of ways to go from there, but that's my position on reasons requirement.
This might be a good time to open up the time to the questions from the audience. And so I'm going to let Professor Franks moderate that for us.
Okay. So, and if for the speakers, if somebody asks one of you a question and the other wants to chime in as well, feel free. And Dr. Irwin, we can't as easily see you because you're right next to us on a screen. So just speak out, and we'll be quiet and listen. So, questions from the audience? Yes.
My question, thank you all for your talks. They were really good, really interesting, stimulating discussion. My question is for Professor Doherty, and it's on your kind of a throwaway remark, I think it might be fair to say, but it's always something that I've wondered about what analytic philosophers are doing when you're doing analytic epistemology as a Christian philosopher.
I've always wondered that too.
The throwaway mark happened when you said that you have this commitment to truth over and above God or Christ or whatever the object of faith is or whatever. But then you said that, well, it turns out that truth is God and is the object of faith, right? So, and you say, therefore, it makes that earlier commitment kind of a fake commitment. That's the throwaway part. So I don't want to do like a gotcha thing here, but because I realize there's probably maybe a throwaway remark, but I mean,
more like recycled.
how does that happen? Right?
Well, I think it mitigates in the end some of what might sound bad when you realize that the whole time I'm still have this relationship towards God that is positive. So Aquinas talks about how there's a certain respect in which everybody pursues God because he's Aristotelian. He thinks, ethics, Nicomachean Ethics 1:1, all agents act for an end. Something becomes an end when it's conceived as good. But notice that to be conceived as good is an intentional relation. It's like it can be bad, but it can be conceived as good, and it's being conceived as good that makes you naturally desire it. But also, you can not realize that two things are identical, like Hesperus and phosphorus, like the morning star and the evening star. And so there's a certain respect in which Aquinas points out everybody desires God because everybody desires the good, and God is the good. And so this may not do, you may think that doesn't do much for the atheist, or you might think this is like really important, that the atheist is in a real relation to God, and a very positive one, that of desire. It's a de re desire. It's not a de dicto desire, but given that God's nature is goodness, to desire goodness is to desire an aspect of God de dicto in a way. And so I do think it is a good-making feature of the atheist that they are in this real and positive relationship with God, even while consciously denying his existence. So it's not nothing. So you may disagree about how much that is, but it's not nothing. Likewise, and it is exactly mutatis mutandis for my comment. Even if you're scandalized by my statement that when considered under the guise of a particular historical doctrine, I'm more committed to the truth as such than any particular historical doctrine or doctrine of the faith. However scandalized you are by that, at least give me this. The thing that I am, in fact, bearing a positive relation towards is God, even if I don't realize that. So it may not. You may not think it's. You might think that's a big deal. Some people think it's enough for salvation, to make me an anonymous Christian, as it were. You may think that's too far, and that's way less than that. But it's not nothing. That's all I'm saying. It's a very good, reasonable question. I like to have my feet held to the fire, non-literally.
Not a Tyndale philosophy graduate, but a fellow Oklahoman. So
That's
Brian,
right.
yes, Brian.
That's right.
Brian, yeah.
Yes, so Professor Irwin, can you hear me at all?
I can. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. So you were talking about Bale's view of mysteries and how they're not susceptible in the same way to the jurisdiction of natural light. And I'm just wondering whether there's a non-circular criterion for what counts as a mystery, right? How do we delineate the set of mysteries without making appeal to the very idea of what's susceptible to the jurisdiction of the natural light?
Yeah, good. This gets to the content part of the talk, and I feel so dumb saying this, but in a longer version of the paper, I appeal to things like historic Christian orthodoxy, the Nicene Creed, and so on and so forth. So the delineation of what counts as core mysteries is something like the unique intersection of things that anyone who, well, that's not true because the Socinians call themselves Christians. A lot of people who call themselves Christians will agree on. And I think that the emphasis on the historical ground and the historical appeal or a historical argument is consistent with other places in Bale, where he says things like, the content of one's religious beliefs is, and then depending on how strong you want to read him, either influenced by, all the way to determined by their upbringing, their family, their context, their culture, and so on and so forth. So Bale is very straightforward about where the content actually comes from. It's just that the particular mysteries that he refers to in his sort of upbringing are these Christian ones. So the content answer is Bale's particular culture and upbringing. I take it, though, that you are also interested in the formal answer, the immunity answer, right? And I think if that's indeed what you're interested in, and I think that the immunity is a structural feature, and that just comes from, I think, the things that reason's acid is somehow incapable of penetrating, right? And so I think that, again, depending on the tradition that you're making reference to, what set of religious beliefs, what culture, what upbringing, and so on and so forth, there are going to be more or less of those kinds of beliefs that would fit into that epistemic core, right? And so it is partially a kind of, gosh, this is going to make me sound really radical, a historical accident in a way. But I think that's Bale's position.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for, in the very back. Could you speak loudly, if you can? Yes.
Great talk, everybody, by the way. Great stuff. I'm not sure if Joe in the black shirt, forget your name,
Trent.
So, essentially, your view on faith was that it was greatly supported by testimony, which is I think, true.
Yes, I'm not sure if the question's being picked up. So part of the question was that my view was that faith is acceptance on the basis of testimony.
Yes.
Yep, exactly.
Awesome.
Doxastic faith,
And
propositional faith.
where does, like, miracles and speaking in tongues, where does that fall for you in evidence? Like, underneath testimony, I would say level of testimony? Like,
You mean if I directly observe what I take to be a miracle, or I observe someone appearing to be speaking in tongues?
Yeah.
What kind of evidence is that? Well, I'd call it explanatory evidence, because it's the sort of, to the extent to which I'm convinced that these things actually occurred, then to that extent, I think that the best explanation of their occurrence is that God was involved. Now, I could have doubts that he's really speaking in tongues. I could have doubts that the miracle occurred, but I definitely think that the best explanation of the observation of miraculous events is theism, and the best explanation, to maybe a lesser degree, of speaking in tongues is that. So if I'm 75% sure it's a miracle, then that's going to, there's an equation that actually shows you how much that should raise your confidence in theism given other things you believe. So it's going to count in favor of theism because it's something that I think probably occurred, and something such that if it did occur, the best explanation of it occurring would be that God was involved.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question, and then we'll call it a night. Yes.
so in your talk, Trent, you said that like most philosophers nowadays are atheists, and you said that, well, it's just nowadays, and it's just a split of space-time.
Mm-hmm.
What would your response be? I'm sure all of you, so anyone, I'm sure you've heard it before, is that people say that we're just becoming smarter on that side.
Yeah, we're becoming smarter than Aquinas and Aristotle and Descartes and Leibniz. So that's crazy. Aristotle and Leibniz were probably the smartest people who ever lived. If you understand anything about Leibniz, the guy was so crazy smart, it's just unreal. I'm sure that Kristen agrees. Leibniz is like super scary smart, super duper scary smart. And think of all the things that Aristotle knew and what little he had to go on. Because Aristotle wasn't just the founder of logic, he was the founder of biology. So remember that Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. And so Alexander the Great, as he conquered all these territories, would send botanical and animal examples of things back to Aristotle. And so Aristotle had this zoo with all these plants and animals, and he liked to lecture walking around in it, which is why they were called the Peripatetics, so the wanderers around in Greek. And Aristotle wrote a book called On the Parts of Animals, and he was encyclopedic. There's a section of his book called On the Parts of Animals called On the Tongue of an Elephant. And here is its entire contents. The tongue of an elephant is exceedingly small and placed very far back in its mouth and so hard to see. But Aristotle couldn't not say something, you know? And he's got another thing on animals and the generation of animals. He's got a section called On the Copulation of Snails. He's like, how do snails do it? Slowly. Aristotle had an unbelievable encyclopedic mind and wrote on everything. Aquinas, think of the breadth of Aquinas' knowledge. Descartes, the founder of analytic geometry, with topics with treatises in optics. Think of the intelligence of Pascal. Insane. The idea that we're becoming smarter is just absurd. We're becoming dumber.
Well, with that,
At least I am.
now let's, if you would help me, thank all of our participants, both those here and back in Chicago. And thank you all for coming out tonight and being here with us and being a great audience for our guests. We really appreciate it. If you're not already, sign up for the philosophy major. So, seriously, thank you again, and have a great night. Thanks.
I'm going to hang out until basically Paul tells me I've got to go.
All right. Thank you, Kristen.
Kristen.
That was fun.
Oh, that must be. I don't eat well.
Yeah, I have one in my and I've got the charger but not the cable in
I
there.
don't think I've got a cable with
Hey
me.
Myron,
Yeah.
I've got one in my room though.
Okay.
So when we leave for dinner, I'll run and grab a cable, and it'll charge it really quick over dinner. By the way, I don't know if you're a techie guy.